Welcome, dear listener, to Stories for Sleep, a place where the past unfolds gently, one sigh at a time. Tonight, we'll wander not in a single empire or city, but along the slow, winding ribbon that once connected civilizations, the Silk Road. And if you enjoy drifting through these ancient pathways, don't forget to subscribe and let us know where and when you listen. Let us begin. Imagine waking up in a tent flapping gently in the breeze, the kind of breeze that brings with it not refreshment, but a fine coating of sand. You squint as sunlight seeps through the canvas seams. Around you lie bundles wrapped in worn cloth some, filled with precious bolts of silk, others with jade, tea, cinnamon bark, and the more practical, if less glamorous, dried lentils. You are a merchant traveling the Silk Road. Not the kind with a camel caravan and a majestic beard gracing gold coins, no. You're the sort of merchant whose feet are cracked from sand and stone. You live each day by the weight of the load and the promise of what lies ahead. The Silk Road, despite its name, was never a single path. It was a loose weave of routes, some baked under the Central Asian sun, others trampled beneath snow-heavy skies. But for you, it's one step, then another. The morning begins with dry bread, dipped in water softened overnight in a goatskin pouch. A little salt, if you're lucky. A nod to your traveling companions, their faces wrapped against the dust. One of them hums a song in a language you don't speak, but you know the tune, an old melody passed between cultures like a kind of shared prayer. The camels grunt as they rise, indignant at their own burdens. You rub their flanks gently, apologizing, aloud, as if they might forgive you for the weight of porcelain packed in straw. Around you, the terrain is indifferent sun-bleached stones, scrubby brush, and the echo of silence that stretches wider than any map. The Silk Road has little patience for sentiment. You begin the day's walk, your sandals slick with yesterday's sweat. The sand makes no distinction between princes and peddlers. It creeps into every fold, every seam, a quiet conqueror of skin and spirit. Yet you press on, because in your satchel is more than trade. There are letters from Samarkand, cents from Kashgar, coins with faces long dead. You carry stories stitched into fabric, ground into spice. The road itself worn, but not forgotten, guides you past way stations. Caravanserais, they're called. Great stone courtyards that welcome all travelers, regardless of coin or creed. You remember the last one, children laughing as they darted between donkeys. A widow from Persia who sold you honeyed figs. A monk with robes stitched in ash gray. Thread who spoke of far-off dynasties as if they were neighbors. As noon edges closer, the heat becomes something you wear rather than endure. You wrap cloth around your brow, creating shade where none exists. The caravan halts for rest, always near a trickle of water, even if it's barely more than a damp. Rock, you share dates, you trade stories. One man speaks of a sandstorm that swallowed an entire caravan. Another swears he saw snow once fall on the desert, and you laugh gently, not because it's false, but because you wish it were true. Rest is brief. The Silk Road teaches you that even stillness has a cost. And so, by mid-afternoon, you're walking. Again, the terrain shifts subtly, sand giving way to gravel, gravel to cracked clay. You pass bones bleached by the sun. Goat, perhaps camel. Perhaps neither. You don't ask. The past sleeps better when left unnamed. By evening, the wind changes. It carries with it a scent of smoke, not danger supper. A fellow traveler has found kindling and boiled lentils. The aroma is plain, but familiar. It speaks of survival, of another day accomplished. You eat in silence, watching the sky deepen from gold to ash to blue-black. Stars prick the sky one by one, a reminder that above this weary road stretches eternity. You lie down again beside your bundles. Tomorrow, you'll enter a village where the people wear robes of red and speak in clipped musical syllables. Yule. Trade silk for furs, pepper for salt. But tonight there is only the wind, the smell of dust, and the slow rhythm of the Silk Road beneath you, endless, indifferent, and utterly essential. Long before the first clatter of camel bells reached its gates, Dunhuang was already dreaming. Tucked between desert and mountain, it seemed an unlikely place for anything but wind and silence. And yet, it became a jewel in the roughened oasis. Town-straddling cultures, like a bridge carved from sand. Imagine arriving in Dunhuang after 2 weeks of blistered feet and hard bread. The gates are unremarkable, but the scent wafting from the markets is anything but steam, broth, sesame oil. You drift toward it not so much walking, but floating, carried by the promises of nourishment and shade. Inside, the town hums. Not with noise, exactly, but with a kind of purposeful motion. Artisans working copper. Monks copying sutras with brushes, thinner than a thread. Traders haggling over porcelain shards and beaded belts. And near the edge of the market, a stall with 5 stools, one of which you claim gratefully. A woman with arms strong from kneading dough places a bowl in front of you. No grand ceremony, just the faintest smile. Noodles, handmade, of course. Thick, slightly curled, floating in a broth spiced gently with garlic, ginger, and the whisper of something you can't quite name. A few shreds of pickled radish, a sprig of green. You inhale, and for the first time in days, you feel alive. Around you, languages swirl. A pair of Uyghur men argue over coinage, while a Sogdian boy translates for a Turkic customer. A monk discusses scripture in Sanskrit, his companion correcting his pronunciation with affectionate exasperation. Dunhuang is a place that forgot how to belong to only one people. You finish your noodles slowly, there's no rush. Here, time loosens its grip. You stroll afterward along a side street where murals are being painted scenes of gods, demons, cloud-walking sages. The artists don't. Pause. Their brushes move with a devotion born not of religion, but of craft. That night, you sleep indoors a luxury. The innkeeper tells tales of ghosts in the dunes and merchants who vanished into the cliffs. You nod, eyes heavy, but you think not of ghosts. You think of the woman at the noodle stall, of how even alone, the harshest roads, someone still boils broth and folds dough. Dunhuang, you realize, is not just a town, it's a promise. That civilization can bloom in the most unexpected places. That even in a land of dust, there can be color, warmth, and a bowl of something that tastes like home. If you had stopped in Samarkand at the height of its golden age, you might have expected music, markets, and mosques. And yes, there was all of that. But for the weary merchant, or curious monk, one of the city's quieter marvels lay not in its domes or minarets, but in its letters. Imagine for a moment a small room with shelves lined not with spices or silks, but with bundles of parchment tied in string. Each roll is a story, a contract for tea, a plea to a distant son, a poem from a lover too shy to sign her name. These were the quieter cargoes of the Silk Road, passed from hand to hand across dunes and mountain passes, more fragile than porcelain, and somehow more enduring. You sit cross-legged at a low table in a back room of a merchant's home, dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The walls are thick with plaster, and the air smells of cedar ink and old fabric. An older man kneels beside you. His fingertips are stained black not with grime, but with words. He is a letter writer. That's his profession. For a fee, he will write what your heart cannot quite say aloud. He asks what you wish to send. You fumble with your thoughts. A message to your brother in Kashgar, perhaps. Or a prayer for your wife, who waits back in a village by the Oxus. Slowly the words come. He dips his brush, the ink flows. and the letter becomes a bridge. Samarkand was not just a city. It was a convergence. Languages met here like waters, flowing into a basin. Sogdian, Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Mongolian, they all danced across parchment, sometimes within the same letter. Translators were prized, but so too were those who could speak only with pen and ink. Calligraphers were honored more than generals, their strokes thought to carry divine beauty. Paper itself had to travel far to reach Samarkand. Originally from China, the secret of its creation was carried westward not by traders, but by prisoners, of war-captured craftsmen who brought knowledge alongside silence. Soon, mills sprung up outside the city walls, fed by water wheels and guarded by stone towers. The first papers were rough, but serviceable. The later ones, those shimmered faintly in the lamplight, soft as silk, sturdy as bark. In the market, parchment sellers shout over each other, hawking bundles as precious as any spice. There are documents with imperial seals, constructions for textiles, instructions for burial, and one astonishing scroll, painted with the stars, is seen from different horizons. You watch a man buy it, roll it up, and slip it into a bamboo tube strapped to a mule. The Silk Road was a place of voices, yes, but more often it was a place of silence, carried in script. Letters arrived months late, sometimes years. One traveler famously received a reply to his mother's death a full decade after the funeral. He cried as he read it anyway, because time on the Silk Road was less a line and more a winding thread. You walk past a school where children kneel on mats, reciting from open scrolls. A teacher guides their hands, correcting their strokes, not harshly but firmly. The script they learn might be Persian today, Arabic tomorrow, Sogdian the next. But they are not confused. They are fluent in motion. As evening falls, the letter writer sees you again. He has finished your message. He reads it aloud, not in your voice, but in something gentler, more measured. Then he folds it, seals it with wax, and presses your own ring into the surface. It is no longer just a message. It is now a piece of you, traveling farther than your own feet could carry. And when the day comes that someone somewhere along this great road unfolds your words and reads them aloud beneath a flickering lamp, they will not think of ink or paper or wax. They will think of you. The desert hides many things: bones, caravans, coins. But sometimes, if you know where to look and you listen very closely, it will whisper a story so old that even the sands seem to hush in reverence. Welcome to Nia. It isn't much to look at now. A scattering of broken walls, sunken courtyards, and wind-carved posts rising like ghostly fingers from the Taklamakan desert. But once, Nia thrived. A small but vibrant kingdom on the southern rim of the Silk Road, caught between empires, languages, and destinies. Imagine walking among its ruins in early morning. The sky is pale, and the light filters in like an afterthought. Your boots sink slightly into the crust of sand as you pass the remains of a wooden doorway. There's no roof above it anymore, just sky. But centuries ago, a family lived here, ate here, argued here, laughed here. In 1901, a British-Hungarian explorer named Aurel Stein came to Nia. With him, camels and guides, tents and journals. He was looking for history buried in the sand, and Nia did not disappoint. Beneath collapsed beams and drifted dunes, his team found tablets. Not stone ones, but wood etched in a language long. Lost to most, known as Gandhari Prakrit, scrawled in the Kharosti script. Legal contracts, household inventories, marriage arrangements. The paper trail of ordinary people. One document recorded a loan for a small amount of wine grapes repayable in a fortnight. Another listed the names of 5 servants, and their precise duties: grinding millet, sweeping courtyards, fetching water, standing watch. Each line was a footprint, each name a whisper. In one home, perfectly preserved, was a loom still strung with threads. Dusty, yes, but you could almost hear the soft rhythmic clack of its former life. Another building contained Chinese coins, Roman beads, and a Kashmiri comb, a mosaic of cultures, pocket-sized and personal. Archaeologists uncovered shoes made of felt, still holding the shape of the foot that once wore them. Sandals with leather straps that had not turned to dust, needles, mirrors, dried dates still folded in cloth, the sort of everyday debris that, by refusing to vanish, told stories with greater intimacy than any monument could hope to. You kneel beside a collapsed wall and run your fingers gently over ancient wood. It's soft with age, but still carries the scent of tamarisk. Somewhere beneath your feet may lie another contract, another name, waiting to be pulled from the soil and remembered. Nia's people lived in a world of limits of water, of time, of politics. But they also lived with astonishing connections. Their town traded with the Han dynasty, learned legal formulas from India, and wrote letters in scripts that would puzzle modern eyes. They were not rich, not powerful, but they mattered. As you stand to leave, the wind picks up. It's playful, not harsh. It tugs your sleeve, as if reminding you, these walls still whisper. And if you pause long enough, you might hear someone say their name. Let's leave the ruins for a moment and return to a living city one with breath in its lungs and sand in its shoes. Dunhuang, the city of gates, of grottos, of guarded secrets and saffron-dyed silks. A place where the desert did not conquer, but conversed, where travelers paused, prayed, and passed on. Imagine its early morning, just as the sun peeks over the dunes. A golden haze coats the air, and the city wakes not with clamor, but with rhythm. A merchant stirs in a courtyard. Room. His name might be Liu Shen, or Rahman ibn Yusuf, or Tsogao. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he has risen with purpose, because today he will sell. He pulls aside a woven reed curtain, letting the cool morning air into his room. Pigeons flutter on the rooftop above. Below, the market is just beginning to hum. A boy chases a goat. A woman pours water into a basin, humming under her breath. The scent of yesterday's fire lingers in the air, mingled with traces of cumin, old leather, and damp cloth. The silk bolts are stacked neatly in a crate by the door, draped in linen to keep off the dust. He checks them anyway, unfolding one, edge and letting the light catch its shimmer so pale it's nearly silver, with threads so fine they could pass through a ring. Outside, the street is a dance of languages. Sogdian traders bark prices to Han scribes. A Persian musician adjusts his tambour. Buddhist monks walk barefoot past stalls selling lacquer bowls and salt bricks. No one is quite local. Everyone is. Just passing through. Dunhuang is not home, but a resting place. As the merchant sets out, he carries not just silk, but a ledger. This thin booklet contains the names of men he's never met, agreements sealed with nods, and the weight of promises yet to be fulfilled. He is literate barely. Enough to read a contract, enough to know when he's being cheated. His writing is angular, hurried, but practiced. He learned it from his father, who learned from his grandfather, both of whom walked this same road in slower years. The market is unfolding like a scroll. Tents bloom in corners, vendors smooth their wares with care. A seller of apricots lines up his fruit into perfect pyramids. Next to him, a pharmacist arranges bundles of dried scorpions and fragments of lapis lazuli. At the edge of the square, a calligrapher writes public messages on hanging boards. Lost camels, price increases, prayer schedules. He finds his usual spot, marked by a crack in the stone wall and a particular smell from the incense stall beside. The incense seller nods without speaking. Familiarity doesn't require words. Our merchant spreads his silks carefully, weighting the corners with stones. Within minutes, eyes gather. A woman with coins sewn into her sleeve leans in to touch. The fabric. A young boy haggles loudly on behalf of his father. A caravan master approaches, squinting, and strokes his beard. They don't buy right away. They rarely do. The day will stretch, and so will the conversation. No transaction is just an exchange. It's a negotiation wrapped in tea and storytelling. Later, a Han soldier stops by, not to buy, but to boast. He's just returned from escort duty through the Hexy corridor. Bandits, frost, boredom, the usual. He spits in the dust and eyes the silk. The merchant offers a square of scrap, one too flawed to sell. The soldier tucks it into his tunic like a charm. Nearby, a storyteller gathers a small crowd. He unrolls a painted scroll and points with a stick, his voice measured and slow. He's recounting the journey of a monk named Xuanzang, who traveled west to gather scriptures. The crowd listens, half believing, half dreaming. A few toss coins. One woman quietly weeps, dabbing her face with her scarf. By midday, the heat curls off. The stones. The merchant takes a break beneath a canopy, sipping watered wine and nibbling on flatbread sprinkled with sesame. A boy runs errands for him, fetching more cloth from a nearby storage shed. They work in tandem, the merchant and the boy, without speaking. There's trust there, the kind built slowly, over lent coins and return change. In the afternoon, a buyer finally agrees to terms. A long bolt of blue silk, stitched with patterns of cranes and clouds. Payment comes in coin, but also in kind. 3 pouches of salt, a small jade pendant, and a favor owed. These arrangements are how business survives in places where banks do not yet reach. As the sun slips low, the merchant packs what's left, and folds the cloth like memory carefully, precisely, respectfully. Each bolt holds labor, not just his own, but that of distant dyers, weavers, carriers, and guardians. Silk, yes, but also sweat and luck. He returns home slowly, not triumphant, but content. He will eat with his neighbors, laugh quietly, and maybe dream of a different town, farther west, where buyers are more generous, and the dust less biting. But for now, Benhuang cradles him, just as it cradles all those who dare to pause here. How do you find your way across a sea of sand? No signs, no street names, no comforting glow of city lights. Only dunes, wind, stars, and the slow, steady tread of camel hooves. Welcome to the most delicate science on the Silk Road, the art of not getting completely, hopelessly lost. In the West, we like to think of maps. We imagine parchment crinkled at the edges, drawn in precise lines. But for many Silk Road travelers, the true map was not on paper. It was in the mind and, more importantly, in the camel's feet. You begin at night. Not at dawn, not at dusk, but when the stars are clearest. The desert is quiet, save for the shifting of sand and the occasional yawn of a sleepy beast. A caravan prepares to move. The leader, old, sun-darkened, patient, checks the sky. He points to a bright star, then to a notch between 2 distant dunes. That's the way. Everyone nods, no one questions. Navigation relied on memory, not just of stars, but of wind patterns, the feel of the sand, even the smell of distant plant life. There was no compass, only experience. Travelers knew to avoid valleys that whispered too much, places where winds swirled with mischief, and directions turned to soup. You walk alongside a camel. Her name might be irrelevant, but the men call her Sarab, meaning mirage. She's moody, slow, but dependable. She knows the way to the next well better than you do. She can sense water under stone. Her feet remember ridges in the sand, long after your own memory fades. Markers were few, sometimes a cluster of black stones, sometimes a lone tree with bark stripped halfway. Occasionally, the remains of an old shrine, half swallowed by the wind. These were the road signs understood not by reading, but by feeling. Caravan leaders taught by telling stories. When the sun is on your left and the air smells of sulfur, you are too far south. If the dunes begin to sing, rest. A storm may come. These weren't riddles. They were survival instructions, dressed in poetry. And there were rhythms. Each day, 20 miles, maybe 30. Walk in the cool hours, rest in the hottest. Feed the camels dried mulberry leaves, salted if possible. Protect the hooves with leather wraps. Never move without filling every vessel, even if the next well is just a short way. Nothing is short in the desert. You sit by the fire one evening, wrapped in your robe. The stars pulse gently above, and an old man sings a lullaby, half in Persian, half in Uyghur. The song tells of a lost traveler who followed the wrong star, and how the desert gave him nothing but sky until he understood which way his heart truly pointed. The others nod. They've heard it before. It's part of the map, too. And when storms come, and they do, the caravan halts, wraps scarves over noses, and turns the camels into the wind. You crouch low, eyes stinging. The world goes orange, then gray, then strangely silent. The storm passes always. And when it does, the desert smooths its face as if nothing happened at all. At the next camp, someone takes a stick and draws lines in the sand. Here's where we started, they say, pointing. And here, this bend, that's where the vulture circled. And the ruined shrine, that was here. The stick moves like a brush, painting geography where no map could exist. Then the wind wipes it away. Still, everyone remembers. The Silk Road was not paved, not marked. It was walked, sung, memorized, and retold. The compass was in the camel's stride, and the old man's song in the crack of dawn against the dune's edge. And in that quiet trust that somehow you would reach the next well before the last drop ran out. When your feet have blistered, when your throat has turned to parchment, and when the sun has cooked you into something halfway between a raisin and a legend, that's when you start dreaming of the caravanserai. Imagine you've been walking for 12 days. Not the sort of walking you do in gardens or shopping streets, but the kind that leaves sand in your bones and makes the soles of your shoes weep. You've long forgotten what a full bath feels like. You carry not only your cargo, but your weariness, and it clings heavier than your pack. Then, on the horizon like a mirage, but sturdier, you see it. A square fortress, low and wide, with high walls and a single arched gate. A place with shade, water, and perhaps most miraculously, conversation. This is the caravanserai. These roadside inns were more than just stops. They were the very veins of the Silk Road's beating heart. Strategically placed about a day's journey apart, they stretched from China to the Levant. And though each one looked different, the purpose was always the same: to protect the fragile humans and their stubborn animals as they passed through the unforgiving world between cities. The gates creak open. A sleepy guard glances at your paperwork, or maybe just your face. He waves you in. Inside, the air is cooler. Not quite cool, but cooler. You step into a courtyard surrounded by rooms sung with wooden shutters, others dark and windowless. There are stalls for animals, wells for water, and ovens still warm from the last meal. A smell floats by lentils, mutton fat, and wood smoke. You claim a spot under a fig tree. A small boy helps you unload your camel, accepting a fig in payment. The beast groans, stretches, and promptly lies down with a theatrical sigh. You do the same, minus the groan, because the silence is its own balm. Around you, others settle in. An Armenian spice trader counts his coins. A Chinese monk fingers his prayer beads. Two Uzbek women in indigo robes pluck each other's eyebrows and whisper gossip between giggles. Soon enough, you begin the ritual of rest. Wash your face, hang your boots, stretch your legs, retie your turban. These are small acts, but they stitch your humanity back together. In one corner, someone lights a lamp. In another, a traveler strums a two-stringed instrument, his fingers moving like water over stone. Nobody rushes. The clock does not live. Here, dinner comes as a bowl of stewed lentils with stale flatbread. It tastes like survival. Someone passes wine made from fermented Marais milk. It tastes like a dare. You drink it anyway, because the man beside you is laughing, and laughter is contagious. Soon, stories float across the courtyard like smoke. One about a ghost near Merv. Another about a merchant who fell in love with a djinn disguised as a widow. A tale of buried treasure, cursed coins, and a man who traded his nose for a magic ring. Are they true? No one cares. They're good. Caravanserais were more than inns. They were information hubs, rumor banks, neutral ground. Inside these thick walls, a Persian diplomat could share wine with a Buddhist monk, or a Jewish artisan could trade ideas with a Turkic mercenary. It was an accidental peace, born not of politics, but of tired feet and shared soup and privacy. Don't be silly. You slept beside strangers, your boots tied to your belt, your coin pouch under your head. At night, the snores of 20 nationalities harmonized into a lullaby only the exhausted could love. The occasional cough, the rustle of blankets, a whispered prayer in a tongue you didn't know, all part of the soundscape. Sometimes someone disappeared in the night. Maybe they left early. Maybe they didn't. Best not to ask. The road has its own logic, and not everyone reaches their next destination. You learned not to cling. At dawn, the courtyard becomes a concert of packing. Belts cinch, animals grunt, oots stomp, and voices echo as people call out goodbyes to new friends they will never see again. A woman hands you a dried apricot. A boy you met last night gives you a scrap of cloth for luck. These small tokens matter more than they should. You step out of the caravanserai, heavier with dust, but lighter in heart. The sun is already rising. You look over your shoulder once, just to remember the shape of the place. The walls stand firm, uncaring. They've seen thousands of faces like yours. They'll see thousands more. But for one night, you were part of its story, and it was part of yours. What language did the Silk Road speak? Was it Persian, whispered in the shadow of minarets? Was it Sogdian, carved into contracts on camel hide? Was it Mandarin, sung softly, through poetry and scroll? Or was it the unspoken dialect of hands, coin, and patient nods? The answer, dear listener, is all of them, and none of them. A Silk Road was not a place of linguistic purity. It was a glorious, tangled marketplace of tongues, sometimes mutually intelligible, often delightfully not. A person could cross 10 towns and hear 10 different ways to say, bread, God, or please don't stab me. Imagine standing in a bazaar in Samarkand. Around you swirl voices like colored threads. Turkic traders haggling over sheep. Persian poets reciting verse. Greek-speaking monks arguing over theology. And Uyghur porters singing work chants in time with their loads. You, standing in the middle, understand very little, and yet you understand everything. Because the Silk Road had its own language, a patchwork of gestures, borrowed words, drawn diagrams, repeated phrases and expressions so universal they transcended speech. Point to your mouth and rub your stomach. You're hungry. Tap your coin pouch and shrug. You want to buy, but not at that price. Laugh, and others laugh with you. Frown, and the deal dies. Sogdian, though largely extinct today, was once the great middleman's tongue. It bridged east and west, spoken in dusty counting houses and at camel watering stations alike. If Persian was the poetry and Chinese the protocol, Sogdian was the grease and the gears. Traders memorized phrases the way one memorizes prayers, not out of devotion, but survival. And writing? Yes, it mattered, but only when deals became serious. Then came the scribes, men with ink-stained fingers and thin patience. They copied contracts in triplicate, each with 3 versions, one in the seller's language, one in the buyer's, and one in whatever third tongue both distrusted equally. This way, everyone was equally confused. Languages mixed freely. Huh? Letter from China might be delivered to Baghdad by a man who only spoke Mongolian and had memorized the recipient's name by the shape of its seal. Children born along the road grew up trilingual by accident. A girl in Kashgar might curse in Arabic, sing in Tibetan, and gossip in Chinese all before lunch. There were pidgins, creoles, traders' codes, some invented on the spot. A raised eyebrow meant suspicion. A hand laid flat over the heart was a plea for fairness. A tossed coin onto a table? Final offer? Words weren't always necessary. Trust rarely came from grammar. And yet, something beautiful happened. Languages didn't just bump into each other, they blended. Scripts fused. Poetic meters bled across borders. A Chinese scroll might carry Arabic marginalia. A Persian tale could find itself retold in Turkic. Verse. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it moved thought. So if you had walked it, you'd likely have learned a little of everything. Enough to ask for water. Enough to avoid being cheated. Enough to say thank you, and sorry, and how much for the goat. That's all you needed. The rest, as always, came from the eyes, the hands, and the road itself. Because in the end, the true language of the Silk Road was not words, but willingness. The Silk Road, despite its name, was not paved with silk alone. No, it was also veined with flavors. It smelled not of fabric, but of spice. Not the kind you sprinkle absent-mindedly on your eggs. No, these were spices that once cost more than gold, whose scent could start wars or seal alliances. They were weightless riches, aromatic ambassadors, the softest of powers. And no merchant caravan worth its salt or cinnamon left home without a few pouches tucked carefully in its load. Imagine the allure of saffron, those thread-like crimson filaments plucked gently from crocus flowers by calloused fingers. Each strand carried the echo of thousands harvested before dawn. A single pound required over 70,000 blossoms, and so a single ounce could pay for a month's lodging and a fresh mule. Then there was pepper, the humble black bead that drove empires wild, grown on tangled vines in the steaming hills of southern India. Pepper was no mere seasoning. It was preservation, heat, bite, a way to make tired meat taste like something new. Romans obsessed over it. Arab merchants guarded its roots. Medieval kings hoarded it like treasure. Nutmeg, too, that unassuming. Little stone could once ransom a village. It came from the Banda Islands, so remote and so monopolized that Dutch ships would sail halfway across the world just to bring back a sack. Clove, ginger, cardamom, each one a note in a fragrant symphony, each worth enough to tempt pirates or bankrupt barons. These spices did not merely sit in jars. They traveled in lacquered boxes, silk pouches, or clay amphories sealed with wax. They were counted, weighed, tested, even tasted by men whose tongues were trained better than any sommeliers. A skilled spice trader could identify a region by sniffing a powder. He could detect fraud from a single sniff. He was part alchemist, part detective. Now picture the journey. Somewhere in the monsoon-drenched Malabar coast, a farmer rises before dawn. He checks his pepper vines. He selects the ripest berries, black with promise, and dries them in the sun. A week later, the precious harvest is weighed and packed into sacks, bound for the port. From there, it may ride aboard a dhow, buffeted by Indian Ocean winds, headed to Hormuz or Aden. Or it may travel up the Ganges, pass through dusty Delhi, win north to the passes of the Hindu Kush. If it's lucky, it will join a caravan, 40 camels, deep on its way through Persia and the great deserts beyond. Each transfer increases its value. A Persian merchant adds a markup. A Sogdian middleman triples it. By the time it reaches a European noble's pantry, that sack of spice has passed through 10 hands and gained 100 stories. But spices weren't just for flavor. Oh no, they were magic. Cinnamon, ground into paste, was rubbed on aching joints. Clove soothed the tooth. Ginger stoked appetite. Nutmeg was believed to ward off plague. And saffron, glorious. Golden saffron was used not only in food, but as perfume, dye, and aphrodisiac. Kings bathed in it. Poets praised it. Priests burned it. It was not just food, it was belief. There was symbolism in the taste. Bitterness meant truth. Heat meant vitality. Sweetness, of course, was the promise of heaven. In courtly banquets from Xi'an to Venice, chefs would compete to layer spice upon spice, creating dishes that were as much ceremony as sustenance. A stew that tingled with cinnamon and clove. A cake rich with rosewater and cardamom. Even the wine might be mulled with pepper, as if to drink courage. But for all their glamour, spices had a dark side. Their value invited envy. Ports were seized. Fortresses built. Colonies founded not for land, but for taste. The Silk Road itself could be seen, in one bitter view, as a long tug of war over the contents of a spice jar. And sometimes there were consequences for excess. Too much nutmeg could cause hallucinations. Too much saffron could make one giddy, even sick. Still, nobles demanded more. To refuse spice was to appear poor. And in an age where wealth and worth were often judged by one's table, few dared serve the bland. So next time you sprinkled pepper on your meal, pause. That small act once stirred oceans and stirred men to greed. That little twist of the wrist once represented a journey of 1,000 miles, and a yearning for more than salt and smoke. If you've ever walked alone through desert twilight, you know that silence makes storytellers of us all. The Silk Road was not only paved with dust and gold, it was paved with legend. The longer the road, the taller the tale. And when the fire burned low and the camels slept, the mouths of men opened to speak of things they half believed. Some spoke of demons in the Taklamakan, not metaphorical ones, real. Sand-dwelling spirits with smoky eyes, and the ability to lure travelers off course with the cries of phantom children. The name Taklamakan itself is rumored to mean, go in, and you won't come out. Entire caravans were said to vanish, swallowed not by storms, but by something else. Others warned of the black wind of Khotan, a gale that carried voices and sickness. To this day, desert winds are feared in Central Asia, not just for their sting, but for their whispers. Traders tied bells to their tents, not just to ward off animals, but to keep the spirits confused. In the mountains, there were tales of snowmen, white-haired giants that left enormous footprints and spooked the yaks. These were not yetis, but older things, watchers, travelers. Said they sometimes found their camps rearranged in the night, fires still warm, bedrolls shifted, and no human prints nearby. The myths didn't stop at monsters. There were stories of cities made of jade, buried beneath dunes, visible only at dawn on the longest day of the year. Of wells that revealed the future in their reflections. Of merchants who made deals with jinn, and paid the price in lost voices or shadowless bodies. One legend spoke of a Mongol trader who carried a cursed silk bolt, beautiful, shimmering, and impossibly soft. But each night he wore a robe made from it. He aged a year. He grew rich. Yes, but old. By 30, he looked 70. He buried the robe in a well and never spoke again. Why all the ghosts? Because the road was hard. Because men feared what they could not explain. Because belief was a comfort and mystery filled the spaces where maps went blank. And sometimes, just sometimes, the legends were true enough. Fossils found in the Gobi might explain tales of dragon bones. Rare electrical storms may have sparked whispers of fire spirits. And as for the vanished, caravans, well, sand does not need a monster's help to erase the past. Still, the stories served a purpose. They taught caution. They bonded strangers around fires. They offered explanations where none could be found. And they reminded travelers that while gold was lovely, survival was divine. The Silk Road was haunted, yes, but not always by ghosts. Sometimes it was haunted by memory. There was something more potent than silk, more enduring than spice, and more transformative than gold along the Silk Road faith. The road was lined not only with traders, but with travelers of a more contemplative sort. Men and women who walked, not to profit, but to pray, who didn't carry bolts of brocade, but scrolls of scripture. They sought not markets, but monasteries. And their footprints carved new spiritual paths between east and west. Some of them still walk today. Start in Luoyang or Chang'an, where the Buddhist faith was rising, glowing like lanterns in temple halls. There, monks and pilgrims gathered, preparing for a journey across desert and mountain to reach the land of the Buddha India. They were often poor, dressed in simple robes dyed the color of ochre or dust. Their possessions fit in a small satchel. But in that bag might be a scripture, copied by hand, or a relic believed to carry the Buddha's essence, precious beyond value. These monks moved slowly. They paused to meditate beneath cliffside shrines, to offer chants in caravanserais, to debate philosophy with passing Persians. Some died before they reached their destination. Others, like the famed Xuanzang, made it all the way to the Ganges, learned Sanskrit, and returned with carts full of sacred texts that would shape Chinese Buddhism for centuries. The road was not only Buddhist, of course. Zoroastrians walked it. Too, the fire in their hearts mirrored by the fire in their temples. They carried their beliefs westward from Persia, leaving symbols of eternal flame etched into rocks and tombs. In the oasis cities of Central Asia, you might find a merchant lighting a flame before doing business, praying for honesty and prosperity. Nestorian Christians made their way east, carving crosses into stone long before Marco Polo wrote his tales. In remote towns, they built churches that combined Roman arches with Chinese tiled roofs. These Christian traders, often from Syria or Armenia, moved quietly but persistently. They didn't aim to conquer hearts with swords, but with stories. And then there were the Sufis, not the warriors of doctrine, but the wanderers of the heart. They danced their way through the desert, spinning poetry in Persian, Arabic, Turkic. They sang under the stars and wrote verses that could make a merchant weep or a bandit pause. They were the Silk Road's mystics, its honeyed voice. They saw no contradiction in praying in a mosque by day and listening to a Buddhist sermon by night. To them, every truth was a thread in the divine weave. Of course, with faith came conflict at times. There were arguments in market squares, quiet tensions in tea houses, suspicions muttered at borders. But more often, there was coexistence. In Samarkand, you could find Buddhist stupas a short walk from Christian crosses, Jewish synagogues not far from Muslim madrasas. The Silk Road didn't erase difference. It stitched it together into something improbably whole. Temples doubled as rest stops. Shrines offered clean water and shelter. A weary traveler might sleep beneath a statue of Avalokiteshvara, whether he believed in her or not. A caravan leader might drop coins into the donation box of a mosque, simply out of habit or respect. Faith moved like perfume, subtle, lingering, carried on the clothes and voices of those who passed. A verse remembered, a chant echoed, a prayer whispered to the desert wind. And slowly, imperceptibly, belief spread not with force, but with kindness, curiosity, and repetition. There were relics, too. A hair of the Buddha, sealed in a crystal box. A scrap of cloth believed to be from the prophet's robe. A book copied from memory, word by word, by a monk too blind to see, but not to recite. These treasures crossed rivers and borders, guarded not by armies, but by devotion. In caves outside Dunhuang, scribes worked for years, creating a library of manuscripts tucked into a sealed chamber. They painted wall after wall with bodhisattvas and celestial musicians. Pilgrims left offering shoes, coins, poems scratched onto walls. They believed the gods read graffiti too. Not every pilgrim survived. Some were robbed. Others succumbed to fever or cold. A few simply disappeared, but their impact remained. Their prayers whispered into the sands. Their footprints preserved in cave dust. Their influence written not only in texts, but in architecture, language, and even the foods cooked in caravan kitchens. A Persian Christian might taste fermented tea for the first time and bring the idea home. A Chinese monk might return with tales of Indian mangoes and Sanskrit chants. A Sufi might quote a Buddhist parable in a poem sung beside the oxus. These were quiet revolutions, but revolutions nonetheless. And so, across centuries, the Silk Road became a path not just for commerce, but for the soul. The traveler with goods might return richer, but the pilgrim returned transformed. He left as one man and returned as many. Or perhaps he never returned at all, choosing instead to settle in some dusty village, teaching children how to bow, how to listen, how to write the names of gods in 3 different scripts. In the end, belief traveled just like silk folded, gently passed hand to hand, easily torn, but never quite erased. And if you listen closely, in the hush between winds in the desert, you might still hear the soft echo of prayer, in Sanskrit, Arabic, Syriac, Chinese, all flowing like a river, too wide to contain. Close your eyes and picture a line of horses cresting the edge of a red rock plateau. The sun is low, dragging its golden hem across the vast expanse of Central Asia. The riders are lean, wrapped in furs and layered silks. Their saddles are worn smooth by distance, their mounts restless but obedient. These are no ordinary travelers. These are the stewards of empire, the horsemen of the Silk Road. To speak of the Silk Road without its horsemen would be like describing a loom without its shuttle. The traders may have owned the goods, but the nomads made them move. Mongols, Sogdians, Scythians, Turks, they were the ones who carved trails into the earth with hooves and hunger, whose sense of direction was stronger than any compass. Here, empires didn't so much rise as gallop. The land was too broad, too shifting, too wild to tame for long. But control the roads, and you controlled the pulse of civilization. The Sogdians were early masters middlemen with sharp tongues and sharper minds. They knew every dialect between Luoyang and Antioch. Their caravans were small cities on the move, their tents vibrant with pattern and debate. They traded in silver and gossip, silk and souls. They weren't conquerors, but facilitators. The Silk Road was their inheritance and their burden. Then came the Turks, and later the Mongols. The Mongols. Their arrival changed everything. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land. He conquered the road. For the first time in memory, A single power ruled from the Yellow Sea to the Black. It was a strange kind of peace backed by arrows, enforced by swift riders, and held together by a strict postal relay system. But for traders, it was a golden age. You could now send a shipment of paper from Hangzhou and expect it reasonably, too. Reach Baghdad. You could ride under banners that promised protection, as long as you didn't provoke the Khan's wrath. Bandits were crucified. Delays were punished. Messages traveled at shocking speed across the empire, thanks to the Amma. Network of way stations and fresh horses. If you carried the right medallion, you rode with imperial blessing. Woe to those who stood in your way. But of course, such unity never lasts. The empire split, factions squabbled, and the road fractured. Still, for a time, the Silk Road became less a name and more a system and artery of motion, running warm, with human ambition. And in between the wild horsemen and dusty roads, the havens, caravanserais. The name itself is a saya cradle for the road-weary. Every 100 kilometers or so, you'd find one. A rectangular compound of mud brick or stone, rising from the plain like a memory of civilization. Inside, the air was cool. A courtyard hummed with low conversation. Camels knelt in the corner, steam rising from their backs. Travelers bathed, prayed, drank tea thick with herbs. Some slept beside their goods, others in upper rooms with latticed windows. Each caravanserai was a world in miniature. Persian doctors rubbed shoulders with Chinese poets. A Sogdian might trade riddles with an Armenian sailor. News passed faster. Then money. And always, in the corner, a quiet old man copying texts by candlelight, because knowledge was a cargo too. Outside, the wilderness whispered. Wolves in the hills. Sandstorms on the horizon. But inside those thick walls, there was safety, conversation, bread, maybe even laughter. For one night, the road stopped. You were not a merchant or a monk or a messenger. You were simply at rest. And yet, looming behind every haven, behind every rider's back, were the empires, always watching. The Tang dynasty in China, their courts painted with jade and ink. The Abbasids in Baghdad, their astronomers, charting stars between contracts. The Byzantines, cloaked in purple and old worry. The Kushans, the Parthians, the Ilkhanids. So many names, like flags fluttering in the wind, some forgotten, some folded into our bones. These empires taxed the roads, guarded them or claimed. 2. They placed customs posts where caravans would bottleneck, eager for coin. They occasionally paved the way with cobblestone or promise. And they clashed, of course. When empires warred, the road became a rope, pulled taut between ambitions. Sometimes it snapped. You might wake one morning in a caravanserai and find that yesterday's passport was today's evidence of treason. Borders shifted with the wind. A village could belong to 3 different rulers in a decade. Traders adapted. They always did. And what of the horses? Oh, the horses were the unsung heroes. From shaggy steppe ponies to elegant Fergana stallions. They were bred for endurance, not vanity. They galloped through blizzards, bore scrolls wrapped in oilskin, and outlasted empires. Their hoofbeats stitched together east and west, long after treaties faded. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was many paths, some skirting deserts, others hugging mountains. It forked and braided, like the mane of a restless steed. And always, somewhere on the horizon, rode another courier, another caravan, another. Shadow cast long by empire. So tonight, as the stars rise over the Tian Shan, imagine those hoofbeats again. Riders crossing frozen rivers. Traders whispering over maps. A lone outpost flickering with lantern light, offering warmth in the void. Empires may rise and fall. The road may fade from maps. But those horsemen, those havens, They linger still, galloping softly through history's dreams. Imagine a city not a capital of empires, but a quiet breath between giants. No golden domes, no soaring temples. Just low clay walls, winding alleys, and shutters worn smooth by time. This was Samarkand, heart of Sogdiana, a place that didn't conquer the Silk Road, but rode it. You might not have heard of Sogdiana, tucked between mountains and desert, but the traders of Sogdiana knew the world by scent and syllable. Their language, Sogdian, was the lingua franca of the Silk Road before any empire stamped its authority upon the sands. You could wander from the eastern gate of Chang'an to the shores of the Caspian and still hear the same soft vowels and clipped consonants whispered over bolts of silk and bowls of stewed apricots. Samarkand wasn't grand like Babylon or orderly like Luoyang, but it was alive. It pulsed not with the thrum of conquest, but with the clatter of markets and the hush of scribes. It was a merchant city, not by accident, but by identity. The Sogdians weren't warriors, and they weren't kings. They were facilitators, the connective tissue between civilizations. Their genius lay not in force, but in familiarity. They knew how to shake hands in 15 ways, how to bow in 10. They could haggle in Persian, chant prayers in Chinese, and write letters in Greek, all in the span of a single caravan journey. And write they did. Oh, how they wrote! Scraps of Sogdian letters have been found in far-flung corners of the road, some still wrapped in silk, others crumpled in camel saddlebags. They're rarely grand. Instead, they murmur of debts owed, cousins missed, spices ordered. One letter, half-faded and patched with care, speaks of a trader pleading for more saffron and describing how poorly the apples are this year in Bukhara. Another bemoans unpaid freight charges and urges a friend to avoid a certain toll road near Dunhuang. These are the diaries of the road. In Samarkand, scribes worked by lamplight, copying documents, prayers, and poetry onto parchment and wood. Some used old silk scraps too frayed to sell. Their writing tools were modest reed pens, black ink, patient fingers, but what they captured was nothing less than the architecture of exchange. Sogdians also had a curious tradition: communal trade. Caravans weren't always funded by a single family or merchant. Instead, a group might pool money, entrusting their goods to a representative, a cousin, a friend, someone's clever nephew. That representative would ride for months, then return, hopefully richer, always dustier. Profits were divided, like bread. Losses were shrugged off with a sigh and a story. They didn't just move goods, they moved ideas. It was through Sogdian hands that Buddhism crept westward, hitching rides with scrolls and stupas. It was through their roots that Manichaeism and Nestorian Christianity found safe passage. These weren't missionaries, but merchants carrying more than they knew. And if you follow the trail of Sogdian art, you find something quietly dazzling. Murals in Panjakent, a small town along the Zirivshan River, show banquets, battles, and dances painted in soft lines and muted color. One figure plays a harp, while another holds a flower as delicately as a secret. There's no bombast, no royal decree, just the daily beauty of people who lived between worlds. Of course, nothing lasts forever. The Arab conquests in the 8th century swept across Sogdiana with the momentum of a storm. Samarkand fell, and the old tongue faded from ledgers and lips. The merchants adapted, as they always did. Some converted, some scattered, and some quietly closed their shop shutters for good. But Sogdian DNA lingers in the road's memory. Even centuries later, Chinese emperors employed Sogdian descendants as interpreters and horse traders. Their scripts found refuge on old murals in forgotten caves. Their customs cooperative trade, multilingual exchange, diplomacy by trade, became cornerstones of commerce. So tonight, as you drift into quiet, Picture the flickering candle in a Sogdian scribe's room. Hear the soft scratch of pen to paper. Imagine the clink of coins being wrapped in cloth, the dry rustle of silk being folded just so. Sogdiana never ruled the road, but it understood it. And sometimes that's the better legacy. We call it the Silk Road, but that phrase is deceptively elegant. It conjures images of gossamer fabric floating across moonlit deserts, delicately. Embroidered in gold, untouched by hardship. The reality? Silk was dragged, bumped, packed tight into wool sacks, and trundled across some of the harshest terrain on earth. Let's rewind a moment and consider what silk even was. In ancient China, silk wasn't just a fabric. It was a symbol. Woven from the thread of silkworms, small, ravenous creatures fed mulberry leaves. It took thousands to make a single bolt of cloth. Every strand had to be drawn carefully from the cocoon, spun, dyed, and woven, often by hands calloused from repetition. Entire households might contribute to a single robe, and before silk could even leave China, it had to survive. China. Imperial officials guarded its production like a holy secret. Smuggling silkworm eggs or cocoons was punishable by death. The notion of foreigners knowing how to make silk was unthinkable. So when silk began appearing in Persia and Rome, it wasn't. By imperial favor, it was through sly hands, clever merchants, and the logic of demand. Once it reached the edge of the empire, silk had to be moved. And that was the true miracle. It's easy to forget now that there were no roads in most places. No highways, no rest stops, not even a decent map, just sand and rock. Silk was often packed inside larger shipments, tucked beneath spices, rolled into scrolls, even sewn into the linings of clothing to avoid detection or taxation. Camels did much of the work. Not just the two-humped Bactrian kind, with their shaggy winter coats and disdainful eyes, but also dromedaries along the hotter southern routes. They walked for weeks with rhythmic, awkward grace, burdened with loads that shifted and groaned. Every day was a negotiation between wind and weight, between man and animal. Caravans rose early, before the heat, following routes marked only by stories. A tree twisted by lightning, a stone shaped like a lion's paw. Some days, the sun would bake the sand until your boots felt molten. Other days, a storm might swallow the sky, turning the horizon into a wall of blur and grit. And yet they carried on because silk was precious. So precious, in fact, that it was often used as currency. Roman senators swaddled themselves in it, convinced it calmed the body. Persian nobles wore it as a whisper of power. Even in distant Europe, people believed silk had healing properties, that it could cool fevered skin, that it might keep nightmares at bay. What those faraway consumers didn't see was the grime. They didn't see the dye-stained fingers of weavers, the cracked hooves of camels, the swollen ankles of caravan guards, nor the heat rash beneath a merchant's robes after 20 days of desert travel. They didn't smell the sweat or the animal musk that clung to the cloth after weeks in a saddlebag. Luxury, in those days, came wrapped in exhaustion. Along the way, silk changed hands many times. A trader in Dunhuang might sell it to a Sogdian, who passed it to a Persian, who bartered it with a Greek-speaking Egyptian. By the time it reached Rome, the fabric was sometimes 10 times removed from its origin, but no one cared. Silk shimmered, silk whispered, silk was desire made visible. And there was risk. Silk attracted bandits like honey draws flies. A poorly guarded caravan might disappear overnight. Local warlords levied taxes official or otherwise. Even customs agents along the road sometimes helped themselves to a sample. Still, they moved it, because they must, because there was something noble in carrying beauty through desolation. something quietly heroic about transporting softness across sharp lands. And so tonight, let your mind wander to a bolt of blue silk indigo dyed and carefully folded resting atop a camel's back. The stars stretch cold above, and the desert sighs below. Somewhere, a merchant hums a tune to himself, a tune his grandmother taught him, one about endurance and grace. When we imagine the Silk Road, it's always the obvious treasures that come to mind: silk, of course, and perhaps jade or porcelain, maybe even gold if we're feeling generous. But behind the grand legends of luxury, the road's heartbeat, pulsed with quieter cargo odd, overlooked, and utterly essential. Not every caravan carried a king's ransom. Some carried the stuff of life: tea leaves, ink sticks, amber beads that smelled faintly of pine and thyme. Let's start with tea. Yes, tea, not the British afternoon kind, with clinking porcelain and pinkies lifted high, but the kind pressed into bricks, stacked like miniature paving stones, and wrapped in mulberry bark paper. For centuries, tea traveled the road not as a drink, but as a currency. Its fragrance mellowed with age, its leaves hardened with distance. A trader might offer a brick of tea for a bolt of cloth, or a dozen bricks for a horse. The tea bricks weren't delicate. They were built to last. They could survive rain, dust, and the clumsy hands of porters. Some were pressed so tightly they had to be chipped apart with a knife. But when unwrapped and steeped in hot water, even over a smoky desert fire, they bloomed into something soft and earthy. A comfort, a taste of home in a land that smelled. Of sand and hooves, travelers swore by it, not just for its flavor, but for its endurance. In high-altitude passes where the cold bit deep, tea warmed the bones. In lowland oases, it refreshed the breath. It was a drink, a medicine, a ritual. Sometimes all at once. Then there was ink. Not barrels of it, sloshing around carelessly, but hard, glossy sticks, black as crow feathers, and carved with dragons or poems. These were Chinese ink sticks, made from soot and animal glue, often scented faintly with sandalwood. They were carried by scholars and scribes, tucked into wooden cases beside brushes made of goat or rabbit hair. Ink was as valuable as language, more, sometimes. Along the road, cultures collided through the written word. Persian poems rubbed elbows with Chinese sutras. Buddhist monks carried scrolls to desert caves in Dunhuang, copying and recopying sacred texts. Traders scribbled contracts. Emissaries drafted letters. Families sent notes across thousands of miles cramped with longing. And grocery lists alike. Ink made all of that possible. And good ink was prized. Smooth, dark, easy to grind. It had to endure the jostling of travel, the swings in humidity, the forgetfulness of human hands. A cracked ink stick was a sad thing, but a whole one? A whole one was a promise that someone, somewhere, would write again. And then the amber. Not mined, but found washed ashore after long Baltic winters, or plucked from forest floors in what is now Ukraine or Lithuania. It traveled south and east in the pockets of traders, glowing like frozen honey. Amber didn't shine like gems or clink like coins. It was warm to the touch, light as a dream, and it smelled faintly of trees. In Buddhist lands, amber beads were strung into prayer necklaces. In Persia, they were carved into tiny talismans. Even in distant China, emperors wore them as symbols of purity and wisdom. Amber had no empire, but it belonged everywhere, and its journey was improbable. From the chill marshes of the north, it passed hand to hand, merchant to merchant, until it reached desert bazaars or temple courtyards. A girl in Bactria might wear a pendant carved 1,000 leagues away. A monk in Tibet might count amber beads while chanting verses in Sanskrit. It was the Silk Road at its most magical, not just east meeting west, but north meeting south, earth meeting soul. But these weren't the only oddities. One caravan might carry cinnamon bark wrapped in goatskins. Another might offer lapis lazuli, mined from the hills of Badakhshan deep blue, speckled with pyrite, like stars trapped in stone. There were rhino horns, not yet endangered, sold as medicine. Dried mushrooms with names no longer remembered. Bird feathers so fine they were mistaken for silk. Coral from India. Ginseng from Korea. Ostrich eggs from Africa, hollowed and painted. And sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes a trader carried only knowledge, a recipe, a story, a joke in a new tongue. A melody hummed quietly as he walked, passed on to the next oasis like an heirloom. You couldn't buy these things, and you didn't always notice when they arrived. But they lingered. A foreign word slipped into a child's lullaby. A stranger's spice in the stew? A curious rhythm in the dance of a village far from where it was born. That was the real Silk Road, not the treasure, but the traffic. Not the opulence, but the overlap. A road where monks and merchants, soldiers and shepherds, couriers and cooks, all shuffled past each other in shared dust. Some stayed. Some moved. On, some forgot. But the objects they carried odd, beautiful, trivial, sacred left trails more permanent than footprints. So as you rest now, dear listener, picture one such object. A single ink stick, smooth and black, packed in a felt pouch and stowed beside a bundle of dried apricots. The caravan is quiet tonight, its camels huddled close, its travelers curled. Under blankets. One merchant sits by the fire, grinding the ink into a dish with a few drops of water. He's not a poet. He just needs to write down how much barley was traded that day. And yet, in that act simple, mundane, and unremarkable, road writes itself again. If the Silk Road was a thread, winding across deserts and mountains, then the oases were its knots, those tiny pockets of life that held everything together. The inns, the caravanserais, the wells, the half-shaded courtyards, where someone was stirring a pot of something faintly edible and deeply familiar. Because for all the glories of long-distance trade and the poetic image of endless movement beneath the stars, humans need to stop. Camels need to drink. Feet need to be unbandaged. And stories, oh, the stories need to be swapped under soft lanterns with cups of warm broth in hand. Let's start in Dunhuang. It sits like a whisper on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. A place with dust in its bones and scrolls in its caves. Pilgrims came here to pray. Scribes came to copy. Traders came to breathe. The inns in Dunhuang were neither elegant nor terribly clean. They were rectangular, mud brick enclosures thick-walled. Against wind and heat, rooms had low ceilings. The mattresses were straw. The light came from oil lamps and the occasional slice of moonlight through a slatted window. But no one complained. Because at the end of 100-mile slog through heat, wind, and ankle-deep sand, you didn't ask for linens. You asked for water and warmth. And maybe, if the host was in a good mood, something hot and starchy to fill the corners of your belly. The inns of the Silk Road were not mere resting places. They were transmissions. You'd sit beside a Chinese herbalist and a Sogdian spice seller. You'd eat boiled millet beside a monk from Nalanda, humming Sanskrit sutras between spoonfuls. Someone might offer you a sliver of cheese, dry and sour. Someone else might tell you who was robbed last week on the pass, or which bridge had finally collapsed. No traveler truly traveled alone. At night, beneath cracked ceilings, with your shoes by the door and your coin pouch tucked under your knee, you were part of something larger, a murmuring collective of the road-weary and world-wise. And then there were the oases: Turpan, Kashgar, Merv, Samarkand, names that hang on the tongue like dried fruit sweet, strange, preserved in sunlight. These towns were not accidents. They were miracles of water in places they forgot rain. Each had its system canals, underground channels, clever engineering that drew moisture from where none should exist. Orchards flourished. Figs swelled. On the trees, goats milled under pomegranate branches. And always, at the center, a bazaar. Picture it, a narrow lane with faded awnings flapping in the wind. A donkey braying in the distance. Spice baskets heaped with color saffron, turmeric, dried rose. A child threading through legs, laughing with a sticky date in hand. And above it all, a song. Always someone sang. A merchant humming an old tune. A beggar with a pipe. A mother, calming her baby with lullabies that had crossed 3 empires to reach her lips. The oasis towns were not just logistical stops. They were breathing lungs in a landscape that otherwise held its breath. They were places where time softened, and the urgency of the road gave way to the slow domestic rituals, baking, bargaining, bathing, resting, and let's not forget the caravanserais. You might think of them as inns, but they were more like fortresses, built from stone or baked mud, with thick wooden doors and high walls to keep out bandits and wind alike. Inside, a central courtyard open to the sky, surrounded by arched rooms for travelers, stables for animals, and storerooms for the precious, breakable, edible things that made the Silk Road matter. By evening, the courtyard buzzed. One man patched. His sandal. Another fed barley mash to a tired camel. Children ran in circles. A few sat hunched over a fire, mending a cloak or drying a scroll. It was messy loud, a bit smelly, and wonderfully human. In some of these inns, there were even libraries. Yes, libraries. Scrolls tucked into niches. Paper-covered bundles exchanged. Between literate hands. Traders didn't just traffic silk and spices. They trafficked ideas, philosophies, techniques, astronomy manuals, maps sketched in charcoal, recipes, fables. You could walk into a caravanserai and leave with a new religion, or a new word for saddle. And amid it all, the glue. Not literal glue, of course, though someone somewhere surely sold it, but the invisible glue of fellowship, of shared hardship, of a kind of gentle dependence where you watched each other's animals, pooled resources. For firewood, told each other which pass was frozen over or which lord was extorting tolls this month. This was a road of individuals, but also of interdependence. And nowhere was that more obvious than at night. After dinner, after the lanterns flickered into softness, people talked. Stories were traded like coin. Not just legends and histories, but small, precious anecdotes. My mother makes dumplings with ginger in the middle. There's a shrine in Khotan where the trees sing. In bulk, they sell honey so thick it doesn't drip. These were the things no customs ledger recorded, the details no emperor demanded. But they held the road together more than all the silk in China. Now, as you rest your own head, wherever you may be, whether nestled in pillows or half lost to the rhythm of sleep, picture one of those caravanserais. The fire's embers are low. The gates are bolted. Outside, the wind hums a gentle note. Across the desert, inside, someone turns in their sleep. A camel coughs. A dog barks once and is still. And beneath the roof beams, scattered on straw and blankets, are a dozen lives paused together, if only for a night. Tomorrow, they'll part again. But tonight, they are knit by need and warmth and proximity. Like the Silk Road itself, threaded by strangers, mended by hospitality. If the Silk Road was a lifeline, stretching from China to the Mediterranean, then there were hands, many hands forever, reaching to snip it. Some wore iron, some wore silk. Some smiled as they did it. For as long as people have carried valuables. Through wild terrain, there have been others lurking in the scrub, hoping to relieve them of the burden. The deserts had their own kind of danger. The heat could break your will, and the sandstorms could skin a caravan down to its bones. But it was in the passes, the narrow cuts through mountains, the lonely ravines, the wooded bends of river trails, where the wolves waited. Not the four-legged kind, though they were there too. The two-legged ones, lean, patient, often desperate, sometimes laughing. Bandits were not just wild men with clubs and snarls. Many were displaced farmers, survivors of failed rebellions, outcasts from their clans. Some were former soldiers, well versed in tactics. Others were locals, born into the hills, who knew the terrain better than the stars did. And while we like to imagine ambush shouts, blades, dramatic scuffles in the dusk, the reality was often slower, more calculated. Bandits watched, waited, followed, knew exactly when a traitor's shoulders would sag low enough to make the attack easier, so caravans adapted. They hired guards, mercenaries with thick arms and thinner patience, archers from the steppes, retired captains with noses broken twice and eyes that didn't blink much. Sometimes the guards were worth every copper coin. Sometimes not so much. The truly cautious traveled in numbers, 50, even 100 camels, lines stretching like centipedes across the landscape. The bigger the group, the more intimidating, the less likely to be picked off. But danger wasn't always criminal. Sometimes the threat wore a seal and rode on a throne. Toll lords, they were called, though few had titles that lofty. Some were petty kings. Others were just local strongmen with a fortified village and a fondness for taxes. They'd set up, shop at choke points, mountain passes, ridge crossings, oasis towns, and claim divine or ancestral right to extract payment. And you paid, or you didn't pass. The toll might be official, a stamped document, a neat exchange. But often it was more negotiable. A few bolts of silk, a shipment of paper, particularly nice horse, a smile and some clever flattery. Sometimes all of the above. In some regions, toll lords offered actual services in return: protection, rest, safe passage. In others, they were little more than well-dressed robbers with gate keys. It was a delicate balance. Too high a toll, and traders would find another route. Too many raids, and no one came at all. But just enough fear, just enough control, that kept the gold trickling in. And then there were the disappearances. You see, sometimes a caravan simply didn't arrive. No battle, no bodies, just silence. Like a verse half sung, rumors would spread. The wolves took them. They strayed too far from the river. They angered the spirits. Their own guards turned on them. Truth was a slippery thing on the Silk Road. And yet people kept walking it, because the road was promise of wealth, of connection, of survival. So they adapted again. Some hired guides, local men with faces like sun-bleached leather, who knew every stone and thorn of their region. Some disguised their wealth, hiding precious goods under bundles of dried fish or sacks of lentils. Some traveled by night, there, camels muffled with padded hooves, whispering to one another as if loud words might summon danger. And some made deals. It's a quiet truth of the Silk Road that sometimes the bandits were family, or cousins, or old friends. Traders would offer a cut. Bandits would allow passage. A wink, a nod, a shared skin of water at the end of a long day. Nothing on the road was pure, but everything had its rhythm. And in the background, always, was fear. Not a sharp, scream-in-the-dark kind of fear, but a soft, constant hum. The knowledge that at any moment, the road could take more than it gave. So you traveled with eyes open. You made friends quickly and silently kept count of your losses. You remembered names and faces. You wore humility like a second robe. You gave to beggars in oasis towns, not out of charity, but insurance. Because One day you might need their help to vanish. Now, as you rest your own eyes, imagine yourself on the edge of such a pass. The sun has set. The stones beneath your feet still radiate heat. Far ahead, a thin trail winds into hills. To the left, an old shrine where someone once left offerings to a forgotten god. To the right, nothing but wind. Your camels murmur behind you. The guards check their blades. Someone hums an old melody to calm their nerves. And you? You step forward. 1 foot, then another. The wolves may wait. But so does the other side. It's easy to think of the Silk Road as all trade and transit. Silk and salt, spices and stones. But what moved just as frequently? What rippled across borders and burrowed? Into lives was belief, religion, yes, but also ritual memory. The little things people carried in their hearts and in their satchels, when the road stretched longer than their courage. The Silk Road was not dominated by a single faith. It was a gallery of gods, temples, icons, and holy men. Like wind brushing. Through tall grass, belief flowed in many directions at once. Start in the east. In China, Buddhist monks set out from the great centers of Luoyang and Chang'an, their robes simple, their intentions vast. They traveled westward in search of sutras, relics, teachers, through deserts and passes, past hunger and illness, driven by something unnameable and luminous. Along the way, they built small stupas, carved cave shrines, shelters where travelers could rest and perhaps find enlightenment, or at least a place to light a lamp and think. Then came the Sogdian traders, yes, but also devout followers of Zoroastrianism. They worshipped fire, truth, and the eternal battle between light and shadow. Wherever they settled, even briefly, they left signs, an altar, a flame, a prayer scratched into a wall. Further west, Manichaeans walked the trail, clutching their scrolls like treasure. Their faith was one of duality, light versus dark, spirit versus flesh. It was a religion that traveled in whispers, often banned, always persistent. And Christianity, yes, that too. Long before it was European and monumental, Christianity slipped eastward with Nestorian missionaries, gentle preachers, with tired sandals, who built humble churches in oasis towns and translated gospels into Syriac and Sogdian. Their crosses were different, flatter, stylized, carved into stone lintels with birds perched gently upon them. And of course, Islam. After the 7th century, its presence grew slowly at first, then steadily. In the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, mosques rose with elegant minarets and flowing calligraphy. Merchants prayed in the direction of Mecca, no matter where they camped. But more than any temple or creed, it was the road's tolerance, reluctant, imperfect, yet real, that allowed these faiths to exist side by side. You could walk from a stupa to a mosque, past a Zoroastrian fire altar, and end your day at a Christian inn. And no one would blink. Not because they agreed, but because the road was too long to waste on argument. The real shrines of the Silk Road were not always marked by domes or bells. They were tucked into bundles, a charm against storms, a figurine from home, a verse scratched into a walking stick, a song sung softly at dusk. Faith traveled not just in ideas, but in habits. The way a man washed his hands, the way a woman greeted the moon, the direction people faced when they lay down to sleep. In many towns, you could find syncretism, those quiet blends of belief that only occur when people truly live beside one another. A Buddhist monk using a Persian word for soul, a Muslim trader lighting incense before a deal, a Christian midwife teaching her neighbors an old Indian lullaby. It wasn't always peaceful, of course, but often it was practical. The road didn't care who you prayed to. It only cared that you kept moving, and in that movement, belief adapted. Some travelers found faith, Others lost it. Most simply carried it, tattered and sturdy like a well-used cloak. And in the quiet hours, as you lay beneath foreign stars, faith became the fire in your chest that reminded you who you were, even when the world forgot your name. So tonight, as sleep curls at the edge of your thoughts, imagine the flicker of 100 little lights, candles, oil lamps, fire pots, each burning in devotion across hundreds of miles. A shrine in the hills, a prayer whispered beside a camel, a hand pressed to a chest in silent thanks. These were the true constellations of the Silk Road. Not stars above, but faith below, glowing softly in the dark. There are many kinds of travelers on a road like this. Some carry silk, some salt, others stories. And then there are those who carry words the written kind, the ones scratched onto paper, pressed into clay, etched into wood, painted on scrolls, or bound in leather. Words that moved not just things, but thoughts. The Silk Road wasn't just a river of goods. It was also a river of ideas, flowing silently between worlds that otherwise might never have spoken to each other. Philosophy drifted westward. Mathematics meandered east. Myths turned into maps, and laws into legends. But where did these words rest when they weren't on the move? Let's begin in Ganhong, a sleepy desert outpost near the edge of China. You'd expect wind. You'd expect sand, maybe some tea and dust. You would not expect a library. Carved into a cliffside were hundreds of caves, hollowed out over centuries by Buddhist monks seeking solitude and peace and perhaps a little shade. These were the Mogao Caves' temples of light, filled with murals and statues in color so vivid it still startles the modern eye. But there was one cave, Cave 17, that hid something even more precious than paint. A sealed room, forgotten for centuries. Behind its bricked-up door, thousands upon thousands of manuscripts. Sutras in Chinese and Tibetan, prayers in Sanskrit, contracts, almanacs, music, medical texts, spells, maps, letters from one side of the world to another, all tucked into that single dusty chamber waiting patiently to be remembered. The monk who sealed the cave, perhaps around the 11th century, may have done so to protect it from invaders. Or perhaps he simply ran out of shells. No one knows. But in that moment, he became a librarian for eternity. Elsewhere along the route, in cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Samarkand, words blossomed. Scribes bent over parchment and papyrus, eyes strained, fingers ink-stained. Calligraphy wasn't just writing. It was art, prayer, and prestige all at once. Libraries were not always what we think of today. They could be private collections tucked into merchant homes, a shelf in a mosque, a locked chest in a caravanserai. Books were rare, expensive, and deeply beloved. A single folio might take months to copy. A misspelling was a wound, a fire, a tragedy. But oh, the things they wrote. Arabic scholars translated Greek philosophy, preserving Plato and Aristotle when Europe had nearly forgotten them. Chinese physicians recorded herbal remedies that would travel to Persia and India. Indian astronomers mapped stars that guided camel herders through endless night. Ideas didn't care where they came from. They simply moved, changed shape, took root. A Persian poem might find itself sung in a Turkish village. A Buddhist koan could be pondered in a Mongolian yurt. A Christian parable might echo through a Zoroastrian courtyard, reshaped and retold. Stories were especially good travelers. They needed no border stamps, no camel trains. Just a voice, a listener, and maybe a fire to gather around. Many were written down, yes, but most were carried in the mind, memorized, shared, woven into songs and jokes and lullabies. A tale told in Bactria might resurface, generations later, in the Caucasus, wearing new clothes but bearing the same old heart. And when the wind blew hard across the desert, even the sand seemed to hum with half-forgotten verses. But what of the writings that didn't survive? Because for every scroll that made it to the present, 100 turned to dust. Wars burned libraries, floods ruined ink. Mice and mold and time had their way with paper. Whole philosophies vanished in a spilled pot of tea or a dropped satchel on a rainy mountain trail. There's a sadness in that, but also a kind of quiet. Grace, because even lost words leave echoes. A proverb quoted by a shepherd might have once come from a vanished manuscript. A folk remedy whispered by a grandmother might trace back to a physician's note in a scroll now buried under centuries. Of stone, and sometimes the road itself tells stories. Stone carvings along the route, graffiti on caravan walls, a merchant's name etched into a beam with a hopeful heart, a faded prayer scratched into the frame of a guesthouse window. These are libraries too fragile, intimate, and deeply human. Ink fades, paper tears, but meaning lingers. You may wonder, who were the people who carried these words? They were not always the powerful or the famous. Often they were humble. A monk with cracked sandals, a merchant's teenage apprentice who copied ledgers at night, a widow who kept her late husband's scrolls hidden in a box beneath the floorboards. Some were translators bridging languages with nothing but patience and intuition. Others were poets chasing beauty across every dialect. Many were simply readers, treasuring each syllable like it was a warm coal in winter. And in every inn, every campfire circle, there was someone telling a story, not because they were paid, not because it mattered to history, but because that's what humans do. They tell. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture this: a moonlit library, no marble columns, no grand halls, just a quiet tent, its flap open to the desert breeze. Inside, a young scribe sits cross-legged on a rug, copying a tale about a dragon, or a god, or a love that outlasted distance. Outside, the camels sleep, the guards hum, the fire dies down. But in that tent, in the flickering candlelight, the ink still flows. And somewhere, down the road, a traveler will read those words. And remember. Imagine walking for weeks beneath an endless sky, your sandals worn thin, the soles of your feet hardened like leather. The dust of deserts clings to your tunic. Your eyelids grow heavy, and each step crunches with the weight of silence and distance. Then just as the sun droops low and the world glows like a copper bowl, you see it, a low, wide compound of stone and wood, sitting alone on the edge of the earth, like a secret waiting to be found. This is a caravanserai, a word stitched together from Persian roots. Karwan, meaning caravan, and sarbi, meaning palace. A palace for caravans, but not in the gilded sense. No throne, no courtiers. Here, the luxury is rest. The wealth is safety. The treasure is a cool drink, a bowl of stew, and a moment when you don't have to watch the horizon. There were hundreds of these resting places along the Silk Road, each spaced just about a day's travel apart. From Anatolia to China, through the high plains of Central Asia and the brutal heat of the Iranian plateau, they appeared like stepping stones for the weary and hopeful. Let us step inside one together, shall we? The gates are heavy wood banded with iron, tall enough to welcome camels, mules, and the occasional ambitious ox. Inside, a wide central courtyard opens up under the fading light, often with a fountain in the middle. Not grand, but purposeful. You can hear the slosh of water in troughs, the hiss of sand brushing stone, and the muttered voices of travelers in half a dozen languages, all tangled like yarn in the air. To one side, there's a stable long, shadowy, and thick with the warm musk of animals. Here, the camels are led and untethered, their burdens removed, their knees flexing as they slowly lower themselves into the straw. Their bells tinkle softly, as they settle into their evening sighs. On the other, rooms line the walls like quiet cells in a monastery. Some are for merchants, some for guards, some for monks or pilgrims. There are plain mats on the floor, maybe a lamp, a shelf, sometimes even a carved window. But after the unforgiving openness of the road, even plain walls feel like an embrace. At the far end, a communal hall half-kitchen, half-gossip center. There is food, lentils simmered with cumin, rice steamed soft, dried apricots stewed in. Copper pots. If you're lucky, flatbread still warm. And there is tea, always tea, poured with the kind of slowness that invites story. You might meet a Syrian spice trader here, gently complaining about the price of pepper in the East, or a Chinese official reticent, measuring every word. A Sogdian scribe, cheerfully translating jokes across 3 languages at once. A Kashmiri monk, content to sit and listen, hands folded over his knee. The beauty of a caravanserai wasn't in its decoration. It was in the pause it offered, the temporary safety, the shelter from more than just weather. Bandits, exhaustion, misunderstanding all kept at bay by thick walls, attentive hosts, and a shared understanding that for one night, at least, all travelers were kin. Most caravanserais were state-sponsored. Kings and sultans ordered them built to support trade and control, to project power across vast territories, but they were also acts of generosity. In many regions, it was considered a religious duty to host the traveler, the wanderer, the stranger from afar, not just because they might bring news or goods, but because they were human and tired. And tired humans need rest. Some were extravagant multi-level, with towers and domes, mosaics glittering in lantern light. Others were cruder ring of mud brick, a hole in the ground for water, a canvas tent at the center. But all served the same purpose, to hold the road still for a moment. Of course, the nights weren't always peaceful. A stolen pouch, a sharp look, a quarrel over weights and measures. But those were the exceptions. More often, travelers shared stories, languages, remedies for saddle sores, tricks to soothe fussy camels, superstitions about which day not to travel. There were rhythms to it all. Arrivals began just before sunset, when the air began to cool and shadows stretched long. Meals were served quickly but unhurriedly, with more salt than needed sweat must be replaced. Lanterns were lit sparingly. Firewood was expensive in desert places. Then came stories, recitations, perhaps a song if someone was brave or nostalgic. Enough. And always there were those who simply slept, right there in the courtyard, curled beside their animals or wrapped in cloaks on warm stone. The stars wheeled overhead, enormous and indifferent. In some caravanserais, a small mosque would sit tucked into a corner. In others, a shrine. Pilgrims passed through these places too, heading not for trade but for salvation. Their presence lent a different kind of silence to the night reverent, breath-held. By dawn, the place would stir again, hooves clattering, wood creaking, boiled water, hands patting down loads, checking knots, sleepy arguments over directions or prices, or who snored too loudly. And then, like smoke, the caravan would vanish out. The gates into the horizon, the next stop a day's guess away. Today, many caravanserais stand empty, their courtyards filled with weeds, their stables fallen silent. But walk through them, even as ruins, and you can still feel it. The hush of gathered breath, the scent of old ash, the echoes of languages long faded. They were more than inns. They were places where the world briefly gathered itself. Where? Difference became dinner conversation, and distance narrowed over bread and dates. So tonight, if you're feeling weary, think of the caravanserai. Imagine yourself crossing a long road of silence and stars, only to find a gate opening before you. A place where rest is not luxury, but law. Where strangers nod in greeting, and your journey becomes, if only for a moment shared. The door is open. Sleep well. Imagine walking through the silence of a forgotten valley. The air is still, thick with the hush of centuries. The sky, wide and unbothered, casts long shadows over half-buried stones. You follow what seems to be a path worn just enough to suggest footsteps, cart tracks, hooves but now claimed by scrub and wind. This was once the Silk Road, or at least one of its many arteries. For all its fame, the Silk Road was never one road. It was a web-braided, frayed, looped, and constantly rewoven. Empires rose and fell, and with them, cities blinked in and out of existence, like stars in an overcast sky. Roads shifted, dried up, flooded, moved with the sands. And with them, people moved or didn't. What remains are ghost roads. Ruins dot the silence, some just low outlines of walls, others collapsed caravansaries, and now and then, a minaret still standing like a question mark above the emptiness. Places like Nia, Lulan, or Merv once prosperous, vibrant, humming, with trade and ambition, now rest under blankets of dust, broken only by the cries of birds or the creak of wind on stone. Take Lulan, for instance. Nestled near the now-dried Lop Nur Lake in what is modern-day Xinjiang, Lulan was a key stop along the Silk Road as early as the 2nd century BCE. A city of merchants, weavers, guards, and water-bearers. It was a place of arrival and departure. But by the 4th century CE, the lake that fed it began to vanish. The rivers that brought life meandered elsewhere, and Lulan withered, not with violence, but with thirst. The desert took it gently, grain by grain. Today, archaeologists step carefully over its remains pottery shards, wooden documents, a woman's shoe, a child's toy carved from bone, the delicate debris of ordinary lives. Reminders that bustling cities can disappear without a whisper. Then there's Merv, once among the largest cities on earth. Persian poets called it the mother of the world. Genghis Khan's armies called it target practice. In 1221, it was besieged and razed, its population decimated. Yet even before that tragedy, Merv had changed hands countless times, risen and declined like a breath. Now, all that remains are crumbling walls and speculative maps, etched with the longing of historians. Why do roads disappear? Sometimes it's the obvious. Wars, invasions, plague. A trade route disrupted by politics or conflict reroutes itself like a river encountering stone. But often it's subtler. A harbor silts up. A new bridge is built. Further downstream, a popular spice falls out of fashion. A dam shifts the flow of a river. And what was once vital becomes quiet. Even nature plays its part. Earthquakes swallowing settlements, floods drowning the paths, or more often, creeping. Desertification, wind, and time conspiring to erase. But Ghost Road doesn't mean dead. In many places, locals still walk those same paths, not with silk or jade, but with sheep and cell phones. A crumbled fort becomes a picnic spot. A dry well now marks the edge of someone's field. The bones of the Silk Road still pulse faint, steady, resilient, and every so often the ghosts speak. In Central Asia, shepherds stumble upon ancient coins in riverbeds. In China's deserts, shifting sands reveal bundles of ancient letters, perfectly preserved. In Iran and Uzbekistan, people still tell stories of ancestors who once hosted caravans or claimed descent from long-gone traders. Even satellite imagery gets in on the act. Scientists now trace long-lost Silk Road branches by spotting faint discolorations. In the soil stretches, where human feet and hooves wore down paths for generations, now hidden under farmlands or wilderness, the roads are never truly gone. just waiting for someone to notice. And some are being walked again. Modern initiatives, like China's Belt and Road Project, seek to revive trade corridors through infrastructure and investment. Highways are being laid, rails built, new cities rising along old routes. Of course, this is not the Silk Road of yore. It's faster, louder, complicated, but echoes remain. Tourists follow them too. Pilgrims in hiking boots, squinting at crumbling walls and imagining camel caravans. Photographers, historians, poets. People seeking not just facts, but atmosphere. The sense of walking inside history, of pressing a hand to the same stone as someone did 1,000 years before. There is something poetic about these ghost roads. They remind us that history isn't a straight line, but a series of loops, false starts, and forgotten trails. They ask us to consider what parts of our own lives might one day fade into dust, and which might remain, waiting to be uncovered. So, tonight, let your mind wander down a road half remembered. Picture the moon casting shadows over a silent ruin. Imagine the whisper of wind over abandoned thresholds, the faint creak of an ancient door. You are not the first to pass here, and you will not be the last. Not all treasures shimmer. Some rustle softly, folded in leather pouches. Some are pressed between fingers, not for wealth, but for words. And some, perhaps, the most powerful, begin with a brush dipped in ink and a quiet moment of breath held before the first stroke. On the Silk Road, paper was power. Before it, messages were carved into wood, or pressed onto clay, or etched onto silk, delicate, difficult, and precious. But in the 8th century, something remarkable happened. According to legend, during the Battle of Talas in 751, Chinese papermakers were captured by the Abbasid Caliphate, and with them, the knowledge of papermaking spread westward like wildfire on a dry steppe. Suddenly, information could move faster than a camel. Imagine a calligrapher in Samarkand, sitting cross-legged in a sunlit room, a reed pen in hand. The paper before him is creamy, slightly textured, smelling faintly of mulberry and starch. He breathes, then writes elegant loops, crisp angles, not hurried, never hurried. The rhythm of the hand matches the rhythm of thought. Script wasn't just utility. It was beauty. From the Chinese kaishu to Arabic kufik, from Persian nastaliq to Tibetan ushin, each culture shaped its own visual melody, and paper was its stage. These weren't just religious texts or imperial decrees. The Silk Road's paper trail includes shipping manifests, contracts, tax records, family letters, jokes, and love notes. One merchant's diary from Dunhuang reads like a logistical dreamscape: bundles of silk, bolts of cotton, shipments of tea, all accounted for with precision that would impress any modern accountant. At Dunhuang's famous caves, thousands of documents were hidden in a sealed chamber for nearly 1,000 years. When rediscovered in the 20th century, they revealed a paper galaxy of languages and scripts: Chinese, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Hebrew, Old Turkish, a kaleidoscope of ink and intention. The calligraphers themselves were often multilingual artisans. They translated not just words, but weights, customs, emotions. Some were monks, others state employees. A few were women scribes of private letters, poems, or holy verse. Their tools were humble: bamboo or reed pens, ground mineral pigments, and blocks of handmade paper. There was a tactile pleasure in the work. The soft scratch of pen on pulp, the slow drying of ink, the careful folding, tying, sealing. Even the delivery bore ritual riders dispatched, pouches stamped, letters received with ceremony. And what of the seals? Ah, those curious symbols pressed into wax or clay. They bore family crests, official emblems, merchants' marks. They whispered. Authority confirmed trust. To break one without cause was no small offense, It was to rupture a thread of the road itself. In the quietest corners of this great network, paper was what kept it together. Not the armies, not the spices, but the contracts, the promises, the records, the poems. And all of it born from pulp and ink. So next time you see paper billet, receipt or a note, imagine its ancestors fluttering across deserts. Imagine the fingers that folded, the minds that weighed each word, the smell of fresh ink in a room of sunlight and silence. And let the road carry you gently forward. Picture a sea not of water, but of grass. An endless rolling canvas of greens and golds, the wind sweeping across it like waves. And on this ocean, ships with 4 legs, horses, sleek, powerful, and tireless. The Silk Road didn't just run. Across empires, it galloped, and those hooves told a story of their own. Before the wheel could roll, the hoof had already conquered. The vast steppe that stretched from Mongolia to Hungary wasn't just a space to cross. It was a world in itself, ruled not by kings but by riders. And to understand the Silk Road, you have to meet them. Enter the horsemen. Scythians, Sogdians, Mongols, Turks, Huns, and countless other nomadic peoples who knew every curve and current of the steppe. Their homes were mobile, their families tied to grazing routes, and their lives inseparable from their animals. To these people, the horse was not merely transport, it was freedom, status, wealth, and war machine. But what made these horses so special? They weren't like the sleek thoroughbreds we see today. Steppe horses were compact, muscular, and astonishingly durable. They could go for days with minimal feed, navigate broken terrain, and survive bitter winters. They had to. There, riders bred them for endurance, not elegance. A single nomadic warrior might ride 5 horses in a day, switching between them to keep each one fresh. Herds weren't just commodities. They were moving banks, rolling stables, and portable firepower. Mounted archers could loose arrows while, at full gallop, turning the very idea of battle into a fluid dance of speed and skill. For Silk Road merchants, these horsemen were both menace and salvation. A caravan without cavalry escort risked everything. Bandits often came on horseback swift, elusive and brutal. So many merchants hired horsemen for protection. Some joined forces with tribes, paying tribute in silk or tea. Others relied on regional rulers who employed these riders as frontier police. But the relationship wasn't one-sided. Nomads, though feared, were also vital participants in trade. They supplied horses, livestock, hides, and sometimes even served as couriers, carrying news or dispatches across vast distances. They were the glue between empires, even if the empires refused to admit it. In fact, entire cities on the Silk Road were born because of horses. Take Turfan in modern-day China, an oasis nestled in the Taklamakan's shadow. It owed its success not just to water, but to its breeding stables. Tang Dynasty officials coveted the heavenly horses of the Fergana Valley legendary creatures, said to sweat blood, most likely due to parasites under the skin, but no less impressive to ancient observers. China sent embassies, gold, even armies to secure them. And these weren't just for parades. Imperial power depended on cavalry. From the Tang's elite horse guards to the Abbasid Gulans, horses were extensions of empire. Riders patrolled borders, escorted dignitaries, and carried secrets across deserts. Diplomacy moved on horseback, so did war. Even Genghis Khan, arguably the Silk Road's most controversial facilitator, understood this deeply. His empire, stitched together by mounted messengers who could cover 200 miles in a day, was a horse-borne network of astonishing efficiency. Relay stations, pastures, and resting yurts made up his version of a medieval FedEx. But beyond logistics and warfare, horses carried stories. Travelers wrote of them with reverence. Chinese poets likened their gallop to thunder. Persian painters captured them mid-leap, nostrils flared, hooves barely touching the ground. Even Marco Polo, no stranger to wonders, marveled at the swift ponies of the steppe and their unflagging pace. Yet, with time, the rhythm changed. The rise of gunpowder, ships, and railroads eventually dulled the hoofbeat. Empires now stretched across oceans, not steppes. The nomads once feared, then hired, were gradually penned in. Their way of life became something to photograph, rather than depend upon. But the echo remains. Even today, across Mongolia and Kazakhstan, you can see boys riding bareback, guiding herds with a whistle. You can find festivals celebrating mounted archery and traditional games played at a gallop. The horse is still there, less a relic, more a heartbeat from the past, steady and proud. So if you ever find yourself beneath an endless sky, the wind in your hair and the sound of hooves in the distance, pause for a moment. You're not just witnessing motion. You're hearing the Silk Road breathe. Some things don't need to shout. They whisper, drift, and linger. They turn heads not with weight or shine, but with presence. Perfume and incense, though silent, invisible. Luxuries moved along the Silk Road like secrets carried on the wind. Let's begin with a scent. You open a cloth pouch. It releases a soft, warm aroma notes of frankincense, maybe a hint of cinnamon, a distant floral undertone. This is not merely a luxury. It's a story. One that started hundreds of miles away in a sap-bleeding tree, or a petal picked at dawn. The Silk Road wasn't only a highway for silk and spice. It was a fragrant artery that carried the smells of empires. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from the Horn of Africa, sandalwood from India, musk from Tibet, rosewater from Persia, and later, adders from Mughal gardens, spiced resins from Southeast Asia, and powdered perfumes from Tang China. Scent meant status. In many cultures, perfume wasn't just cosmetic. It was spiritual, medicinal, and political. A Chinese envoy might bring rare incense as tribute. An Islamic scholar might burn oud while reading, believing the smoke calmed the mind. In Byzantium, a visitor might be judged not by his robes, but by his scent. Temples used it. Mosques cherished it. Palaces were steeped in it. Burning incense was a ritual, a symbol of the divine, the refined, and the rare. Kings bathed in perfumed water. Nobles wore scented pouches on their belts. Even soldiers might carry a tiny sachet for protection, for memory, or simply for comfort. And then came the traders. Scented oils traveled in delicate glass bottles, sometimes nested inside padded boxes. Incense arrived in pressed cakes, wrapped in silk or parchment. Traders knew the value wasn't in weight, it was in longing. A whiff of a distant land, the breath of a remembered home. But there was danger, too. Scented goods were delicate, prone to spoilage, theft, or fire. Caravans. Carrying frankincense sometimes attracted more attention than those bearing gold. And unlike grain or jade, fragrance didn't announce itself. It had to be experienced, trusted, proven. Some traders became known for their blends. Recipes were guarded like state secrets. In Damascus, families passed down incense formulas as heirlooms. In Kashgar, perfumers learned to adjust their oils for the changing seasons. The craft was as much about intuition as it was about skill. And it wasn't just the elite who indulged. Markets bustled with scent. Flower sellers, oil vendors, spice grinders. A poor traveler might spend a week's wages on a single dab of perfume for a gift, a bride, a funeral. Smell, after all, reached everyone. Even pilgrims brought it. They carried scented packets to burn at shrines. Small bundles of herbs for protection. Incense for trade or offerings. Monasteries along the Silk Road burned it not just for prayer. but to mask the smell of close quarters, to uplift the spirit, to purify the air. Imagine a caravanserai at dusk, the air thick with the aroma of stewed lentils, animals, dust, and then someone lights a cone of incense. Slowly, the scent curls through the arches. It wraps itself around tired limbs. It soothes. The road, for a moment, becomes sacred. Today, we still chase those aromas. We bottle oud in Paris. We blend adders in Mumbai. We burn Japanese incense, made with Cambodian wood. The Silk Road taught us that scent has no borders. And long after the camels slept and the pavilions folded, the perfume lingered on the robes, the skin, the letters. Proof that sometimes the lightest cargo is the one that lasts the longest. Let's pause for a moment and imagine yourself as a traveler along the Silk Road. You have a caravan, a few camels, a list of stops in your mind, and not a single map that's truly reliable. Because for most of the Silk Road's heyday, the world was not a neatly labeled atlas. It was a vast and shifting riddle. A haze of rivers with 10 names, cities drawn in the wrong hemisphere, and borders that moved like shadows. The maps we know today? They're the product of centuries of trial, error, and sheer guesswork, much of it done along the ancient arteries of Asia. In the ancient world, map-making was less about precision and more about perspective. A Chinese cartographer, for example, didn't draw maps for navigation the way a sailor might. He sketched landscapes as ideological tools centering China, labeling far-off lands as strange or mythical, and rarely attempting to scale. A Roman map, on the other hand, was often a collection of waypoints, inns, rivers, milestones, not a geographic layout, but a travel itinerary with illustrations. And then there were the maps that weren't even drawn. Many Silk Road travelers worked with memory, oral accounts, and a deep trust in the knowledge of local guides. The best maps, often, were human ones, men and women who had walked the road before and knew which oasis had fresh water, which pass was snow-free in spring, which tribe offered hospitality, and which demanded bribes. Yet even without GPS or Google Earth, cartography did exist, and it was alive with wonder. Take the Chinese Da Ming Hanyi Tu, a map created during the Ming Dynasty. It stretched Asia and Africa across a horizontal plane with provinces, labeled in beautiful calligraphy and mythical creatures dotting the outer rim. Or the Islamic world maps of Al-Idrisi in the 12th century, with south placed on top and cities drawn in loving miniature Damascus with its orchard rings, Samarkand like a starburst in the center. Each map was a worldview, and many were gloriously wrong. One legendary map from the 6th century showed a land in the east where people walked upside down. Another suggested that giant ants guarded gold mines in India. Some depicted Central Asia as a land of headless men with eyes in their chests. But you see, these weren't mistakes in the usual sense. They were placeholders, symbols for places just out of reach, just barely imagined. And sometimes they were cautionary tales. Sailors feared the black water beyond the Indian Ocean, where ships were said to vanish. Travelers spoke of magnetic mountains that pulled iron nails from carts. Certain regions were marked with a simple warning, "Here be dragons." And while not always literal, the message was clear beyond this point: you're on your own. But slowly, through dusty boots and ink-stained fingers, the road reshaped the maps. Buddhist monks crossing the Taklamakan brought detailed knowledge of desert trails. Muslim geographers like al-Biruni described the circumference of the earth with astounding accuracy. Chinese travelers such as Xuanzang returned from India with stories and sketches of distant rivers and temple cities. Step by step, the world shrank not physically, but perceptually. Caravans helped too. Merchants might not have thought of themselves as explorers, but they remembered distances, landmarks, and directions. A trader knew that from Bactria to Dunhuang took 32 days, assuming clear weather and no bandits. A guide might know 5 ways through the Pamirs, each with its own set of hazards. Over time, this information wove its way into sketches, notes, and finally inked maps. It wasn't always peaceful work. Maps were also military tools. An emperor needed to know where to send troops, which border to defend, which river to cross. First, Genghis Khan's generals used maps to plot invasion routes. Chinese dynasties marked tribute routes in crimson ink. European crusaders scrawled Saracen territory across areas they didn't understand but feared. The Silk Road was not just commerce. It was conflict, diplomacy, and information exchange on paper. And then came the dreamers. Marco Polos. Travels-inspired maps that placed Cathay and Shipangu, Japan, like jewels in a fantasy archipelago. Later, Renaissance maps merged myth and memory, placing giant lakes in Central Asia, or a second Nile snaking through Persia. Some were laughably off. Others were strangely accurate. But all of them carried the fingerprints of the Silk Road. Even today, if you open a dusty drawer in an old university archive, you might find a parchment with mountains that look like upside down. VS, dragons coiled around corners, and oceans dotted with ships under full sail. You'll see names half forgotten. Sogdiana, Transoxiana, Sirica. Some vanished, some renamed, all real once. And perhaps the most remarkable thing, these maps didn't just record the world. They imagined it into being. They dared to sketch the unknown. They reminded every merchant, monk, and mule driver that beyond the next ridge might lie something unseen, an empire, a river, or a myth. And in a way, those maps are still with us. In our guidebooks, in our satellite images, in the way we draw. Borders or name roads. So next time you unfold a paper map or swipe across one on your phone, remember the Silk Road scribes who didn't have the answers, but drew anyway. Because sometimes, to find your place in the world, you must first dare to draw it. Along the dusty ridges and shaded caravanseries of the Silk Road, people spoke more than languages. They whispered secrets, scribbled hopes, hid warnings in plain sight. For beyond the trade of silk and spice, this long, winding route also traded in ideas and encoded many of them in scripts and ciphers that, even now, continue to tease scholars and delight the quiet-hearted curious. Imagine yourself in the corner of a darkened tent. The fire crackles, casting silhouettes on rough woven fabric. A merchant unwraps a small bundle, revealing a letter not in Chinese, not in Arabic, but in a flowing alien script. To most, it looks like a decorative flourish. But to the trained reader, it says, "Trust no one in Kashgar. The governor has changed." This was the world of hidden tongues. The Silk Road, by its very nature, was a corridor of communication. From the bustling streets of Luoyang to the gardens of Samarkand, from the bazaars of Aleppo to the scholarly corners of Baghdad, countless languages coexisted: Persian, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Syriac, Greek, Arabic, Uyghur, Mongolian, Chinese, and dozens more, some now lost in the sands of time. Each brought its own way of shaping thought, its own way of labeling the world, its own method of hiding a truth within a phrase. Let's begin with the most humble of tools, the written word. Sogdian merchants were famed for their letters, often scrawled in ink on thin paper, tightly rolled and sewn into garments or tucked into saddle linings. These messages weren't always encrypted, but their obscurity came from the language itself, Sogdian, a tongue known mostly to a merchant class, using a script that blurred easily in hurried hands. It wasn't exactly a cipher, but it functioned like one to the untrained eye. Then came the traders of Central Asia, who used multilingual notes to navigate diverse cities. A single invoice might include Greek numerals, Arabic dates, and a few lines of Persian poetry, perhaps to flatter a client, or perhaps to say more than the weights and measures recorded. These layered texts turned every document into a small, poetic puzzle. And where merchants go, spies are never far behind. Governments along the Silk Road knew the value of information. Court scribes and imperial messengers sometimes used codes to transmit news of troop movements or political unrest. The Tang dynasty maintained a sophisticated postal relay system, complete with secret seals and rotating cipher patterns. A seemingly innocent travel permit could, in fact, contain a warning if you knew how to read the color of the thread binding it, or the way a character was tilted just so. Likewise, in the Islamic world, particularly during the Abbasid Caliphate, cryptology became a formal science. Scholars like Al-Kindi wrote treatises on frequency analysis, the art of deciphering codes through patterns. Imagine, if you will, a scholar hunched over parchment in a Baghdad study, carefully tallying how often each Arabic letter appears in a love letter or an intercepted note. Not exactly James Bond material, but precise, quiet, brilliant. Then there were the travelers who concealed ideas through metaphor. Buddhist pilgrims on the Silk Road often wrote in parables or allegories, especially when crossing through regions where their faith was unwelcome or misunderstood. A verse about lotus blossoms might actually contain instructions about temple rituals. A story of a distant mountain might mask the location of a hidden monastery. To the devout, it was scripture. To outsiders, it was beautiful nonsense. Poetry itself was a kind of encryption. Persian poets, especially in cities like Nishapur and Herat, wove political dissent into verses of longing and stars. A king might appear as a lion, a tyrant as a shifting wind. Lovers' meetings became metaphors for divine justice or the cycle of dynasties. It was safer, after all, to sing than to shout. And in the margins of holy books and account ledgers, tiny notations bloomed like secret gardens, little symbols, half-sketched words, doodles that meant more than they seemed. These weren't always grand secrets. Sometimes they were just reminders, jokes, or minor protests. But they told of lives lived between the lines. People who used the space between the known to say what they could not say aloud. Even textiles whispered. Certain weaving patterns in Central Asia had meaning beyond their decorative beauty. A particular knot might signify allegiance to a clan. A border motif might reference a story, a prayer, or a warning, and the wearer would carry this code on their back, known only to those with the eyes to see. But of course, secrecy is never just about hiding. It's about trust. The use of secret scripts and coded messages created communities of merchants, monks, revolutionaries, and dreamers who saw in each other not just business partners, but kindred minds. You can imagine the moment of recognition when a traveler in Khotan spots a familiar symbol scratched into a doorway and knows they've found a friend. Or when two scribes exchange glances over a disputed document, each aware of what's really written between the lines. Over time, many of these languages faded. Some scripts are now deciphered only by specialists. Others are completely lost scripts found carved into cliffs or inked onto paper that crumbles at the touch. What did they say? Recipes? Warnings? Declarations of love? No one knows. But perhaps that's part of the magic. The Silk Road was never just about what was sold or seen. It was also about what was hidden, what was hinted at, what passed in silence with a nod of a head or a phrase, spoken in a dying tongue. So as you drift toward sleep, think of the quiet ones, the scribes, the translators, the poets with tired eyes and ink-stained sleeves, the ones who never made history's headlines, but who shaped its language, who passed along secrets not by shouting, but by whispering just loud enough for the right ears to hear. And in their hidden syllables, the Silk Road lives on. There are places where silence reigns. Not the pleasant hush of a sleeping home, or the rustle of distant leaves, but a heavier stillness. The kind found only in desert ruins, where time has forgotten to keep moving. These were once bustling cities' waypoints on the Silk Road, where laughter, bargaining, prayer, and even betrayal echoed across sun-baked walls. Now, only sand shifts in their place. Let us walk slowly and gently through those forgotten cities. You might imagine Lulan first a ghost city lost to the Taklamakan Desert in western China. Lulan once stood proud near the Lapnor Lake, a crossroads of travelers and ideas. But now, nothing remains but fragments of wood, a few weathered texts, and the odd skeleton uncovered by archaeologists decades ago. The wind there carries no language anymore. And yet, Lulan was once essential, hosting merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims, who leaned into its precious water and brief shade before pressing onward. It's hard to believe, really, that such a crucial stop could vanish so completely. But Lulan was not alone. Along the great ribbon of the Silk Road, dozens of small kingdoms bloomed and withered, each one a brief flicker of light in the darkness of vast deserts. Kingdoms like Kurena, Shanshan, and Nia, places that today are barely footnotes in textbooks, but in their time held the weight of empires in negotiation. Nia, for instance, lay in what is now southern Xinjiang. Its ruins tell us stories. In fragments, wooden documents preserved by the dry climate, written in the Korosti script. They include contracts, tax records, even household inventories. One document lists a pair of shoes given as tribute to a superior official. Another mentions a gift of scented oil. Ordinary things, beautiful in their quietness. The people who lived here were not kings and conquerors. They were scribes, farmers, caravan drivers, people with cracked hands, leather belts, dusty feet. They ate barley porridge and dried apricots. They watched the stars shift above their homes, homes now buried under centuries of dust. They were, in every sense, real, and yet the sand has swallowed them. These cities had their own rhythms, tied to the pulse of trade. When the caravans came, life surged, inns filled, markets bloomed, temples lit candles in thanks. And when war or drought interrupted the route, the cities dwindled. One by one, they became abandoned stones beneath the dunes. But their stories didn't vanish entirely. In the early 20th century, explorers from faraway lands came searching for these ancient towns. Men like Aurel Stein, Sven Hedden, and Paul Pelliot braved sandstorms and bandits, armed with maps, camels, and boundless curiosity. They dug beneath the silence and uncovered papyri, wall paintings, and coins. Aurel Stein, in particular, had a knack for finding what had been misplaced. In Nia, he found legal documents preserved so perfectly that one could read the names and arguments of long-dead landlords. These weren't romantic ruins. They were administrative archives. And yet, there's something tender about that. These desert kingdoms did not build pyramids or cathedrals. Their monuments were ledgers, contracts, and receipts. Their glory was in the grain they stored, the roads they repaired, the inns they cleaned before a caravan arrived. And perhaps that's more enduring than gold. Even today, satellite imagery sometimes reveals ghost footprints in the sand-dark lines. Where old roads ran, square shapes where houses once stood. Technology reaches backward now, seeking what wind and time erased. But even the best tools can only tell us so much. What did it feel like to live there? The best we can do is imagine. You, curled in a mud-brick home beneath a reed roof, the wind, pressing against the walls. Outside, your donkey tied to a post, munching dry grass. The scent of sesame oil in the air. A scrap of foreign fabric folded neatly beside your sleeping mat, your one souvenir from a passing caravan. And beyond your door, the echo of a world constantly moving, pausing only long enough to let you be part of its story. There is something sacred in that quiet ordinariness. Now these places lie still, but once they were maps of human desire, outposts of cooperation and ambition, moments of fragile peace. The desert didn't hate them. It simply waited. And when the trade routes shifted and the wells dried, it took them back. So tonight, as you settle in, think of those vanished cities, not as ruins, but as paused pages in the book of history. Their lives were not loud, but they mattered, just as yours does. Quietly, completely. And though they are gone, their stories linger, carried on the wind, etched into the dry earth, waiting for someone soft-hearted and curious enough to listen. Every road worth walking has its shadows, and the Silk Road, for all its poetry and beauty, was no different. Among the silk bales and the cinnamon, the gold coins and camel bells, moved another cargo. People, not always slaves. Sometimes something stranger, something more ceremonial. Let us meet the princely captives. Imagine a young man barely more than a boy, wrapped in silks of his homeland, but shackled by oath or defeat. A prince taken in battle, not harmed, not sold. Instead, offered a gilded prison in the heart of his conqueror's court. He is to eat well, study court manners, and smile when spoken to. But he is not free, not truly. Throughout the centuries, the Silk Road was dotted with these uneasy arrangements. Hostage diplomacy, it was called, a practice as old as empire, as sharp as politics. When two kingdoms made peace, or when one surrendered to another, it was common to send a royal child or noble as assurance, a living promise. Take, for example, the Sogdian nobles sent to Chinese courts during the Tang dynasty. They arrived with perfumed letters and tribute, but also as quiet captives. The Chinese emperors, wary of betrayal, welcomed them with ceremony and then monitored them closely. These youths were trained in Chinese customs, sometimes even married into Chinese families. All the while, their home cities knew that any act of rebellion could bring swift retribution. These were not chains of iron, but of politics. There are stories, too, from the Byzantine Empire, of royal children sent eastward, raised among foreign languages and customs, then returned as adults, changed, hybrid, unsure where they truly belonged. They were both diplomats and strangers, a kind of living bridge between worlds. But the Silk Road was not always so ceremonial. In times of war, captives were taken without permission or ceremony. Mongol generals seized noble sons and scholars, alike some to ransom, some to keep. Marco Polo writes of entire populations being displaced, resettled like chess pieces across the map. Artisans taken from conquered cities were relocated hundreds of miles away to build new homes, new palaces, new lives. Their talents were valued, their freedom, not so much. And yet, not all was bleak. Many of these captives were treated with relative dignity. A prince taken might become a general. A scholar captured might rise as a court astrologer. The Silk Road, in its strange logic, often rewarded flexibility. If you could adapt, if you could charm, if you could prove useful, you might not only survive, but thrive. Still, the wound lingered. To be far from home, forced to dine with those who defeated you, to wear the robes of a culture that was not yours. This was a quiet kind of sorrow, one not easily expressed, one that slipped between the lines of letters, in the melancholy curves of calligraphy, in the sad tunes of traveling musicians. We see traces of it in surviving records, poems, written in exile, letters pleading for release, quiet notes asking after aged parents back home. A prince might smile in court, but his dreams wandered the hills of his childhood. A craftsman might carve a new city's mosque, but sketch his own village in the sand at dusk. Captivity, whether ceremonial or cruel, was part of the Silk Roads. Truth, but here too we find resilience. Because these captives often became connectors, they learned new languages, blended artistic styles, wove new philosophies into their old beliefs. Many became diplomats in their own right, translators of culture, unwitting ambassadors of hybrid identity. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture that prince, seated quietly beside a fountain. The garden around him smells of jasmine and wet stone. He listens to the wind and remembers a different wind in a faraway land. He is not free, but he is not broken. He waits, he watches, he learns, and in his quiet survival, the Silk Road breathes again. The Silk Road was more than a route for silk and spices. It was a passage for pain, healing, and hope. For every wealthy merchant and silver-laced envoy, there were aching feet, infected wounds, and tired bodies dragging themselves forward through deserts, mountains, and freezing winds. And where there is pain, there is always someone nearby trying to soothe it. Welcome to the world of the caravan healers. Imagine a lean, sun-darkened man walking beside a train of camels. His pack doesn't carry fabric or coin, but jars bone, clay, or sometimes glass. Inside, dried herbs rattle with each step. Powdered licorice root, crushed frankincense, and bundles of wormwood tied with twine. There's a tiny bronze blade for bloodletting, a curved horn used in cupping, a water skin not for drinking, but for mixing salves. He doesn't boast, but many owe him their comfort, and some their lives. He is not a doctor as we know them today, but he's a healer, someone who understands the human body just enough to keep it going. Throughout the vast distances of the Silk Road, medicine was as diverse and intertwined as the cultures that traveled it. A Chinese physician might carry scrolls of traditional acupuncture diagrams, while a Persian healer would know the teachings of Galen, filtered through Arabic translations. Indian Ayurvedic knowledge mingled with Tibetan practices. Each traveler added a little to the story. And because sickness does not respect borders, neither did medicine. Let's walk into one of the way stations where a caravan rests. It smells of sweat, dust, and the unmistakable tang of boiled herbs. A man has broken his toe. He slipped on an icy riverbank 3 days ago, and it's now blackened with infection. The healer arrives, hands already stained with turmeric and soot. He unwraps the foot, murmurs a prayer in his native tongue, and begins. Hot cloths, a poultice made from onions and ash, and finally, a charm strung with silver and blue beads tied. Just above the wound. He doesn't know if it will help, but it cannot hurt. And besides, sometimes belief is the strongest medicine. Superstition and science traveled hand in hand on the Silk Road. You might find a Roman talisman worn beside a Buddhist protection knot. Chinese traders often carried tiger bone or dried seahorses for strength. Mongol warriors believed in the healing power of fermented mare's milk. In the Middle East, healers wrote Quranic verses on parchment, dissolved them in water, and had the ill drink them. There was rarely judgment, only pragmatism. If it worked, it stayed in the bag. And let's not forget the illnesses that spread. Plague, smallpox, fever with no name. The Silk Road didn't just carry ideas, it carried pathogens. One sneeze in a market town might ripple through the arteries of Asia and reach the heart of Europe within weeks. Some historians believe that even the infamous Black Death rode the caravan paths westward from Central Asia, hitching a ride with fleas, rats, and merchant goods. So the caravan healer was also a quiet guardian, a fragile barrier against the tide of sickness, sometimes successful, often overwhelmed. But in the face of disease, they innovated. Along the route, certain cities developed small clinics or healing houses, usually attached to religious buildings. Buddhist monasteries provided rest and warm broth to travelers. Islamic madrasas often doubled as infirmaries. Nestorian Christian. Monks, especially in Persia and Syria, were famed for their surgical skill and botanical knowledge. And the patients? They came in every language. A Turkish merchant with a tooth abscess, a Sogdian dancer coughing blood, a Korean monk with blistered feet. All were treated with the same rough compassion, because illness humbled everyone, no matter how finely they dressed or how far they had traveled. The writings of traveling scholars tell us much. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine reached Chinese hands through translators along the Silk Road, and elements of Chinese pulse theory influenced Persian diagnostics. In turn, Indian pharmacology informed both. One Chinese text from the Tang dynasty even records the medicinal uses of frankincense long before it was native to East Asia. Medicine was a shared language built on pain, experiment, and memory. But not everything was written down. Much of what we know about these healers comes from oral stories, ethnographic accounts, or archaeological finds. A bronze lancet buried with its owner, a medical charm worn threadbare, a mortar and pestle wrapped in cloth inside a grave. These things hint at the constant, patient work of people who had no university, no title, but who kept others alive through intuition, luck, and herbs plucked from the earth. Let us remember, too, the women. While most caravan healers recorded in texts were men, women often acted as midwives, herbalists, and comforters along the road, especially in the smaller stations or among nomadic groups. A mother treating her child's fever with river mint, or a wife pressing hot stones to her husband's aching back. These acts of care, though unwritten, mattered just as deeply. So tonight, as you rest, picture one of those dusty healers seated by firelight. He gently grinds saffron into a basin, the glow catching the rim of his weathered cup. A cough sounds behind him. Another traveler in need. He doesn't flinch. He stands, stretches his back, and begins again. Because healing, like travel, never truly stops. If the Silk Road had a golden age of structure, it was under the Mongol Empire. Yes, those same Mongols whose names still ring with fear in history classrooms. But history, as always, is more nuanced. For under the iron rule of the Khans, the Silk Road became safer than it had ever been. Banditry nearly vanished. Roads were maintained. And the postal relay system, called the Yam, could get a message from Beijing to Baghdad faster than many nations manage mail today. But beyond the roads lay the courts. And those courts? They were something else entirely. Imagine stepping into the court of Kublai Khan. The air is perfumed with sandalwood and the scent of roasted lamb. Huge silk banners hang from ceiling beams, carved in dragon shapes. Servants in brocade rush past, carrying trays of sugared dates and fermented Mare's milk. At the center, on an elevated dais, sits the Khan himself draped, not in armor, but in gold-threaded robes, his beard oiled, his eyes sharp. He listens as diplomats speak in Persian, Chinese, and Latin. One by one, they bow and present gifts: a jade tiger, an illuminated manuscript, a clockwork bird that chirps when wound. This was diplomacy Mongol style, direct, theatrical, and governed by precise etiquette. The Khan's court was a swirling mix of Mongol, Chinese, Persian, Russian, and even European customs. Interpreters were vital, so was curiosity. The Mongols, though brutal in conquest, were intensely interested in the knowledge of the peoples they conquered. Astronomers from Samarkand taught in Yuan academies. Venetian merchants, like the Polo family, dined beside Persian engineers, and Tibetan monks. It was chaotic, and it worked. Law under the Mongols, codified in what they called the Yasa, was strict but consistent. Theft was punished harshly, but tolerated less because the roads were so well patrolled. Contracts were respected. across vast distances. A merchant with a stamped pass from the Khan could travel from Korea to the Black Sea with surprising ease. And they did, but court life wasn't all politics. It was also opulence. Feasts were legendary. Mongol cuisine blended Chinese delicacies with Central Asian heartiness. Roasted meats, spiced stews, fried pastries filled with nuts and honey, and endless pitchers of Arag fermented Mares milk that packed quite a punch. Singers from Armenia, dancers from India, and poets from Persia entertained the court in turn. Everyone spoke with a translator, but everyone understood the music. Yet, beneath the glitter, there was calculation. The court of the Khan was a place to be watched, to maneuver, to survive. Every toast was a test, every alliance a dance. One wrong gift, one poorly chosen word, and a merchant could find himself on a camel back to nowhere or worse. And still, people came, because the court of the Khan, for a time, was the center of the world. It linked oceans and empires. It made the Silk Road not just a path, but a promise of protection, of wealth, of possibility. And in the echoes of its songs, the clink of its goblets, and the whispers in its scroll-filled libraries, the world changed. As you drift to sleep tonight, think of that dazzling court of velvet tents beneath the stars, of whispered plans and shining silk. A place both brutal and beautiful, and very, very real. Close your eyes for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Now imagine that breath carrying not the scent of your room, but the essence of a caravanserai, the dry sweetness of crushed rose petals, the sharp bite of clove, a touch of wood smoke, and something else, lingering and musky, like ancient amber trapped in the folds of a silk robe. This was the smell of the Silk Road, not just its goods, but its memory. Of all the treasures that traveled the road, scent was among the most invisible yet evocative. And the business of smelling good, or at least of smelling intentional, was surprisingly central to the empires and cultures that lived and breathed along this artery of commerce and conquest. Let us begin in the oases of Central Asia. Picture a merchant from Samarkand carefully sealing jars of rose oil each drop, pressed from thousands of petals gathered at dawn, when their fragrance was most potent. These oils, called attar, were precious, light, and intensely concentrated. Just a smear on the wrist could last for days. A single flask of attar, secured with wax and wrapped in cotton, could be traded for bolts of silk or handfuls of lapis lazuli farther east. Meanwhile, in the Arabian Peninsula, caravans loaded with frankincense and myrrh set out from Dhofar and Hadramaut, the resin still sticky to the touch. Cut from sacred trees with hooked knives, these resins hardened in the sun and were packed into leather sacks. Once ignited on a charcoal disc, the curling smoke carried with it the power to cleanse temples, soothe minds, and ward off illness, or so people believed. Incense was far more than pleasant, it was spiritual. Buddhist monks, along the Chinese branch of the Silk Road, lit incense sticks each morning as they chanted sutras. In Zoroastrian fire temples of Persia, sacred fires were fed fragrant woods. In Indian shrines, sandalwood paste was smeared onto statues of gods. In Christian churches, censers swung from chains, trailing clouds of sweet-smelling smoke over the heads of the devout. Scent was a bridge between the visible and the invisible, but it was also political. One of the most luxurious gifts a visitor could bring to a royal court was perfume. In the Tang dynasty, ambassadors from the Abbasid Caliphate gifted Chinese rulers with flasks of musk and oud oil, which quickly became fashionable among courtiers. Empresses would dab it behind their ears. Noblemen would scent their robes with it. And soon, Chinese alchemists were experimenting with their own fragrant blends. And knowledge of perfume making traveled just as surely as silk. Arabic manuals on distillation techniques made their way east. describing how to extract oils from flowers using alembic stills, an early form of chemical engineering. These techniques later reached Europe, changing how the West made perfume forever. But in the meantime, on the road itself, scent had more humble roles too. Merchants burned incense in their tents to mask the stench of sweat and animals. Traders carried sachets of herbs to place inside bundles of fabric, protecting against moths and mildew. Women in cities like Bukhara or Kashgar perfumed their hair with oils and wore tiny pouches of dried jasmine around their necks. Travelers might chew cardamom or clove to freshen their breath before entering negotiations. One Chinese traveler in the 8th century described walking into a market tent where the air was thick with perfumes, so sweet that one might forget the dust and the heat. Fragrance, like silk, became synonymous with refinement. But there was also something deeply human about it. The road was long. Baths were rare. Camels didn't care if you wore oud. And so, perfume was also about dignity, about maintaining a sense of self amidst the dust. Imagine a tired woman trader, her feet cracked and raw, sitting by a fire and rubbing a bit of scented balm into her temples as the stars come out. That small ritual, personal, private, was a reminder that even in the wilderness there was beauty. Interestingly, different regions developed their own scent profiles. The Chinese preferred lighter, floral scents: osmanthus, lily, and lotus. In Persia and the Arab world, heavier musks, ambergris, and oud were favored. Indian blends leaned towards sandalwood, saffron, and sweet spices. Central Asians, especially the nomadic Turkic and Mongol peoples, appreciated pungent scents like thyme and cedar, which also repelled insects. Sometimes, perfumes were used in more unusual ways. Some travelers rubbed musk on letters to ensure their scent lingered with the recipient. Others used perfume as currency in places where money meant little, but a pleasant smell could open doors. One record from the Yuan dynasty tells of a tax collector who accepted a jar of jasmine balm as payment because it reminded him of his youth in the south. And let us not forget the dark side of scent, the obsession. The desire for fragrance drove. Wars fueled envy and created monopolies. Trees that produced oud were often guarded like gold mines. Musk, derived from the glands of musk deer, became so valuable that entire hunting expeditions were organized solely to acquire it. The ethics of these practices rarely troubled the powerful. What mattered was who smelled the best. Perfume makers became alchemists, chemists, and poets rolled into one. And yet, much of their work has vanished into thin air, literally. Unlike textiles or coins, scent leaves no fossil. All we have are the bottles, the recipes, and the stories. But tonight, as you drift into sleep, you can imagine it. A twilight market where a woman uncorks a tiny flask and lets you inhale a blend of saffron, rose, and smoke, a scent older than nations, a breath of history. If cities were the great theaters of the Silk Road, then the vast steppes and deserts were its quiet interludes, the long, empty spaces where travelers moved slowly beneath the endless sky. And in these spaces, the most precious thing wasn't silk or spices. It was a cup of tea, offered by a stranger inside a tent of felt. Hospitality was not a courtesy. It was a law. To refuse shelter to a traveler in need, especially one who bore no ill will, was to risk divine punishment in many cultures. And so, across the Mongolian steppes, the Kyrgyz valleys, and the sandy plains of Turkestan, a culture of warm welcomes blossomed among the nomads. Let us step into one of those tents. The outside is plain, a circular dome of felt stretched over wooden poles, known as a yurt in Turkic regions or ger in Mongol lands. But inside, the air is thick with the scent of milk, tea, and wood smoke. Colorful rugs cover the ground, and sheepskin cushions offer a place to sit. At the center is the hearth, the soul of the home. A woman, strong and weathered, ladles steaming tea from a pot and offers it without a word. You sit, you drink. The road fades. This is Sutei sea-salted milk tea, brewed with black leaves and chunks of butter or cream. To the uninitiated, it's strange. To the weary, it's divine. Every traveler along the Silk Road came to cherish these oases of kindness. Because life in the open was hard. Wind bit through layers of wool. Sand crept into saddlebags. Food spoiled. And loneliness gnawed. But here, in these tents, people were fed and stories were exchanged. A Persian poet might recite verses beside a Kazakh shepherd. A Chinese monk could find shelter beside a fire shared with Kyrie's hunters. Hospitality blurred the lines between stranger and guest. Among Mongol hosts, the act of sharing a meal was sacred. Refusing to eat was an insult. Refusing to host was dishonorable. Even when food was scarce, a host might offer dried cheese curds, arul, dried meat, or warm fermented mare's milk, arag, to a visitor. Generosity meant survival. The Silk Road would not have worked without this unspoken contract of trust. Caravans could not carry enough food or water for the entire journey. They relied on the kindness of these nomadic families. And in return, the nomads gained stories, tools, foreign spices, and news from lands they would never see. These tents were the original information centers. One night's stay might reveal the price of silk in Dunhuang, rumors of war in Bactria, or the new marriage alliance of the Persian Shah. Gossip flew faster than the wind, and often more accurately. And the stories ran deep. Nomads might sing the epics of Manus, or tell legends of the sky wolves who guided their people across the steppes. In return, a passing merchant might share tales of floating cities in the west, or temples carved into mountains in India. It was all traded, truth, myth, and everything in between. Inside the tent, all were equal at least for the evening. Of course, politics lurked outside. Tribes fought. Clans schemed. Bandits existed. But for the length of a meal, there was peace. You were a guest. You were safe. And when morning came, the tea was poured again. A prayer was muttered. A blessing was given for your journey. Then the host would turn back to their sheep, and you would walk once more into the wind. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine sitting in that warm, flickering tent. The wind howls outside, but inside there's laughter, tea, and the quiet. Hum of a world held together, not by empire, but by kindness. Imagine yourself in a quiet monastery, perched on a windswept cliff along the Silk Road, the afternoon sun casting long shadows over faded murals. Here, ancient scrolls lie rolled and stacked, telling stories of gods, men, and the ever-shifting faiths that traveled alongside silk and spices. The Silk Road was far more than a route of trade. It was a crossroads of belief, where scroll met. Scripture and faiths touched gently, sometimes clashed, but mostly mingled in the dust. Travelers along this ancient highway carried with them not only goods, but ideas, visions of the divine, from one end of Eurasia to the other. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and countless local traditions all wove themselves into the spiritual tapestry of the region. Close your eyes and imagine a small caravan halting near Dunhuang, a city famed for its Buddhist caves, where monks recite sutras in Sanskrit, while merchants from Persia quietly discuss the Quran's verses. The air is thick with incense and possibility. The journey of Buddhism along the Silk Road is one of gentle persistence. Originating in India, its teachings spread through Central Asia and China by monks who are also scholars and translators. In the 4th and 5th centuries, as you would have seen, Buddhist pilgrims carved out caves in cliff sides, filling them with statues and manuscripts. These caves, bright with gold leaf and painted silk banners, are not merely places of worship, but cultural hubs, preserving art, poetry, and philosophy. Yet, Buddhism did not travel alone. Nestled beside these caves are places of worship for Manichaeans, a religious group blending elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism itself. Though now almost vanished, their texts, written in several languages, show how fluid religious boundaries were on the road. Further west, the open steppe saw the rise of Nestorian Christianity, a branch known for its missionary zeal. You might imagine a traveler wearing simple robes, carrying scrolls inscribed in Syriac script, gently offering prayers in a world dominated by other gods and spirits. These Christian communities built churches along trade routes, their crosses, shining under foreign suns, silently witnessing centuries of change. And Islam's arrival transformed the Silk Road's spiritual landscape in profound ways. Beginning in the 7th century, Islamic merchants and missionaries traveled along these routes, bringing with them not only goods like dates and spices, but also teachings that spread quickly among city dwellers and nomads alike. Mosques rose in oasis towns, their minarets silhouetted against vast skies, becoming centers of learning and law. But the Silk Road was not just a meeting place, it was also a place of dialogue and sometimes tension. Imagine a bustling market where a Buddhist monk exchanges respectful words with a Muslim scholar over tea, discussing the nature of compassion. Nearby, Zoroastrian priests might quietly observe from a temple's shadow, guarding their ancient fires. This coexistence was a delicate dance, often peaceful, but sometimes uneasy. It is worth noting that few believed in forced conversions. The road encouraged curiosity, not coercion. This allowed for remarkable syncretism, the blending of beliefs and practices. For instance, in Central Asia, Buddhist deities took on the robes and halos of Persian angels. Christian icons appeared alongside traditional nomadic symbols. Even the rituals of prayer mats and incense burned found echoes in multiple traditions. These minglings are visible in the art left behind. The frescoes at Dunhuang show Persian-style dancers performing for Indian gods. Coins from various empires depict symbols from different faiths, side by side. Manuscripts often contain annotations in several languages, written by monks, traders, and pilgrims, each adding their voice to the shared spiritual chorus. In small mountain monasteries, monks compiled encyclopedias of knowledge, mixing medicine, astronomy, and theology. These texts, carried by camel and horse, informed rulers and scholars far from their point of origin. As dusk falls, imagine the quiet of a campfire where travelers, weary from their miles, share stories of the divine, each narrative slightly altered, passed from mouth to ear, colored by the accents and beliefs of the teller. The road itself was a sermon in motion. And so, as you drift toward sleep, picture yourself amid those ancient scrolls and scriptures, a witness to the gentle mingling of faiths, carried not by armies or empires alone, but by quiet devotion and the patient persistence of human curiosity. As the sun sets on our journey along the Silk Road, we find ourselves at a crossroads of history and memory. The great arteries of trade that once pulsed with life began to slow, winding down like a fading song, yet like a whispered legend. The spirit of the Silk Road endures, echoing in the stones, stories, and traditions of the lands it once connected. Imagine yourself standing in a dusty caravanserai, now silent, its walls cracked and faded. The bustle of merchants, the clatter of hooves, the chatter of countless tongues, these have slipped away, leaving behind only traces, like footprints in sand soon to be erased. What brought this great decline? The answer is neither simple nor abrupt. For centuries, political upheaval battered the Silk Road's stability. The Mongol Empire, which once unified vast territories, fractured into competing khanates, each guarding its patch jealously. Borders hardened and tolls increased. Banditry surged in the vacuum of authority, making passage perilous. Simultaneously, new maritime routes began to lure trade away from overland paths. The age of exploration opened oceanic highways, where goods could travel faster and in greater volume aboard ships. Spices, silk, and precious metals sailed around Africa, connecting Europe to Asia in a way that felt more reliable than months in the desert sun. As caravans dwindled, cities along the road lost their vibrancy. Markets shrank, artisans moved away, and many caravanserais fell into ruin. Oasis towns, once vital hubs of exchange, turned into sleepy villages. Yet the story is not one of mere disappearance. In fact, the Silk Road transformed rather than vanished. Trade routes shifted northward or southward, adapting to political realities. Some goods continued to move in smaller caravans, while cultural exchanges persisted in quieter forms. Religions that spread along the road found new homes. Art styles, inspired by Silk Road motifs, appeared far beyond their original centers. And local populations preserved memories, oral traditions, folktales, and songs that kept the road alive in their hearts. Nomadic tribes continued their ancient migrations, carrying the rhythms of the Silk Road in their stories and music. The traditions of hospitality, trade, and exchange endured in villages scattered across deserts and mountains. The Silk Road also lives on in the modern imagination. In the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers and archaeologists rediscovered lost cities, cave temples, and caravanserais buried under centuries of sand and time. Manuscripts thought lost were found in hidden libraries, revealing a kaleidoscope of languages and cultures. These discoveries rekindled interest in a network once thought forgotten. Even today, the modern Belt and Road Initiative echoes the ancient Silk Road's ambition, aiming to reconnect East and West, not just through commerce, but through cultural understanding. As you lie down to rest, consider how the Silk Road's legacy stretches beyond silk and spices. It is a reminder of humanity's restless spirit, the desire to explore, to connect, and to share. It teaches us that even when empires crumble, when roads go quiet, the threads of memory and culture persist, weaving a tapestry that is both ancient and ever-renewing. In the quiet of the night, with the hum of modern life fading, imagine the camel's slow footsteps, the murmur of languages blending, and the scent of distant incense carried on the wind. The Silk Road story is not just about what was lost, but what remains a gentle pulse beneath the surface, inviting us to listen, to learn, and to dream. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a bustling modern city, where ancient and new worlds meet. Perhaps it's Xi'an, once known as Chang'an, the eastern terminus of the Silk Road. Here, skyscrapers rise beside old city walls, and the scent of street food mingles with the hum of traffic. The Silk Road is no longer just a trail through deserts and mountains. It has transformed into an idea and enduring symbol of connection, exchange, and curiosity. The Silk Road today is a ribbon of cultures woven into the fabric of globalization. It is easy to forget, amid satellites and smartphones, that for centuries, this network was humanity's great bridge, a place where goods, stories, religions, and innovations traveled in steady, patient rhythm. Imagine the caravans of camels, replaced by cargo ships, trucks, and high-speed trains. The ancient route spirit pulses quietly beneath the surface of our hyper-connected world. In the countries once touched by the Silk Road, China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Turkey, and beyond, efforts to revive and commemorate this history have blossomed. Museums exhibit recovered treasures, intricate silks, ancient coins, and manuscripts inscribed in dozens of languages. Archaeological sites have become places of reflection and wonder. Local artisans continue to craft goods in traditional styles, echoing techniques that traveled these roads centuries ago. The new Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, launched in the 21st century, aims to rekindle the ancient spirit of exchange. Infrastructure projects seek to build roads, railways, and ports that connect East Asia to Europe and Africa, echoing the route's original intent to foster trade and friendship across borders. Yet, unlike the slow caravans of old, these modern highways hum with the speed of globalization. Still, the lessons of the Silk Road remain quietly powerful. This ancient network was not merely about commerce. It was about the human need to connect, to understand, and share beyond language and distance. It reminds us that cultures are not isolated. They are linked through countless invisible threads woven over centuries. Consider the arts and sciences. Paper, invented in China, traveled westward, changing the way knowledge was recorded and shared. The compass guided sailors far beyond familiar shores. The exchange of ideas along the Silk Road shaped everything from medicine to music, architecture to cuisine. This gentle diffusion helped shape the modern world, often in ways unnoticed. Today, you might find yourself sipping tea flavored with spices once carried on camelback, or admiring motifs in textiles, inspired by centuries-old patterns. In some villages, old festivals continue, celebrations of seasons and trade long past, but still alive in memory. Yet the Silk Road also invites us to reflect on what it took to sustain such a vast network. The travelers faced harsh deserts, freezing mountains, and uncertain alliances. Many never reached their destination. The road was a constant struggle of survival, negotiation, and hope. These truths remain as humbling as the vast landscapes it crossed. As night falls and the world quiets, imagine those same vast skies once navigated by caravans lit by stars. The gentle sound of hooves on dust, the whisper of distant languages carried on the wind. The Silk Road's legacy is a lullaby of connection, inviting us to slow down, listen, and dream of a world where curiosity and exchange continue to enrich us. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let the Silk Road's story wrap around you, a gentle reminder that though empires rise and fall, and routes fade and shift, the human heart's desire to connect remains constant and enduring. Thank you for joining this tranquil journey through the forgotten history of the Silk Road. As the ancient trails fade into the quiet of night, may you find peace in the knowledge that across time and distance, the rhythms of human connection endure gentle, persistent, and always inviting us home. If you enjoyed wandering these ancient pathways with us, please subscribe to Stories for Sleep and let us know where and when you listen. Your stories help keep history alive, softly guiding us all into restful dreams. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams carry you along the winding Silk Roads of the past.